A storm raged across the skies of Dromund Kaas. Thick clouds spiraled over jagged mountains, and the air stank of ozone and ancient stone. It had been that way for centuries. But the Jedi temple stood still, carved into the black cliffs like a secret not meant to be found. Inside it, one man stayed long after the others had gone. Ajunta Pall did not speak much. He listened, not to the Jedi around him, but to the Force itself. The wind, the hum of the air before lightning struck, the silence in a tomb before the scream. He had not always been this way. Once he had been a teacher on Coruscant, celebrated for his clarity, his wisdom, his gift with the Force. But even then, he had looked past the Jedi code, and into the places it refused to reach. He did not seek to control the Force, he wanted to understand it. And so he asked questions the Council would not answer. Why does the Force allow death if it is life? Why does it heal, but also destroy? Why does the dark side feel clearer? The Jedi whispered behind closed doors. They called his studies dangerous, his experiments unnatural. But no one could deny his brilliance. He had mastered techniques lost to time. He could slow aging. He could hear thoughts before they formed. Some said he had even brought the dead to speak. But Ajunta knew something they did not. He had seen the limits of the light. On Dromund Kaas, where the storms never ended, he meditated alone for months at a time. The temple, there was not like the others. It had no gardens, no statues, no warmth. Only jagged halls, cracked stone, and murals half erased by rain. It was a place the Jedi had built during an earlier war, and then abandoned. Too dark, too far. Ajunta stayed. He read from holocrons others feared to touch. Some were Sith in origin, others were older. He studied Jedi texts that had been locked away about Force alchemy, about creating life, about binding essence to matter. He didn't want power, he wanted meaning. But the Force is not kind to those who stare too long into its heart. One night, as lightning shattered the sky and the wind howled like dying stars, Ajunta collapsed. His body seized, his eyes burned. And in that moment of pain he saw something. A vision. The future. Jedi in flames. Cities turned to ash. A red-skinned species kneeling before him. His own hands, soaked in blood. He awoke on the cold stone floor, breathing hard, heart racing. He told no one. Not the Jedi Masters who sent messages from Coruscant. Not the old allies who had once studied beside him. They would not understand. They would say the dark side had touched him. That the storm had broken his mind. But he knew better. He had touched something real. Something the Jedi had long since tried to forget. The Force did not divide itself into light and dark. That was a lie of the fearful. It was whole, terrible, beautiful, and it demanded understanding. Ajunta Pall stood at the edge of that truth. And once a man looks over that edge, he cannot unsee what waits below. The Jedi Code was taught as truth, unchanging, eternal. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. Ajunta Pall had recited those words more times than he could count, as a Padawan, as a knight, as a master. But he no longer believed them, not fully. Because for years he had lived in peace and still felt emotion. He had studied knowledge and still found ignorance. He had sat in serenity and still heard the chaos in his own thoughts. The code was not wrong. It was incomplete. And like all incomplete things, it broke under pressure. In the archives of Dromund Kaas, beneath layers of dust and neglect, Ajunta found fragments of older teachings, scripts written by the first explorers of the Force, words not spoken in the temple anymore, words that described the Force not as balance, but as war. One fragment stood out. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. It had no author, no Jedi seal, no context, just a single line above it, the Code of the Exiles. Ajunta read it again and again. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the clarity in the words, or the fact that he understood them. They were wrong, of course. The Jedi had said so. Passion leads to obsession. Strength becomes cruelty. Power corrupts. Victory destroys peace. But Ajunta was no longer sure they were right. Because he had seen what the Jedi became when threatened. During the war against the legions of Leto, they had not shown serenity. They had not meditated in defense. They had led armies, killed, justified it as balance. The Jedi preached peace, but they feared losing control. And fear was the first step into the dark. Ajunta kept his doubts hidden. He wore the robe, spoke the words, led the meditations. But inside, something had changed. He had tasted truth that the others refused to acknowledge. He had seen death and had not looked away. There were others like him, quiet, observing, asking the same questions. Not many, but enough. Some were healers, others archivists. A few had served on the front lines and returned scarred in ways the Jedi refused to name. They met in silence, spoke carefully, never too loud, never too often. They weren't planning rebellion. They were searching for honesty. And in the center of them all was Ajunta, not a leader, not yet, but a voice that made their questions feel sane. He told them of the Force's true nature, how it created and destroyed without judgment. How the dark side was not evil, only feared. How the old Jedi had once walked both paths, until the Council decided which half to silence. He called it correction. Others called it heresy. But they listened. Because somewhere, beneath the silence of the Jedi Code, they had all heard it. A second voice, calling to them. Older, stronger, closer to the raw current of the Force itself. It didn't speak in commands, it spoke in hunger, in promise, in memory. The Code of the Jedi gave them discipline, but the code they were not allowed to speak gave them something else. Purpose. Ajunta did not yet know where the path would lead, but he felt its gravity, pulling, quietly, inescapably. And for the first time in his life, he was not afraid. They gave him honors, commendations, titles. Ajunta Pall was not just a Jedi master. He was a name spoken with respect and unease, the kind of mind that unsettled even those who agreed with him. He taught with clarity. He debated with calm precision. And yet, no one truly stood beside him, because he believed things no Jedi dared to say aloud. He said the Force had a will, but no morality. He said death was not a lesson, it was a problem. He said peace was not the natural state of life, but a lull between storms. And in every lecture hall, in every meeting with the High Council, he saw it in their eyes. They could not refute him, but they feared where his logic would lead. Ajunta did not shout. He did not rebel. He simply continued. He returned to Dromund Kaas again and again, until it no longer felt like exile. It felt like home. He built a personal chamber in the deep tunnels of the temple, not a place of reflection, but of experimentation. Here, the Force was not worshipped. It was studied, bent, stretched, questioned. He worked with rare minerals, bonding the Force into their atomic structures. Some glowed when he spoke, others cracked from within. He forged small objects that resisted decay. A blade that could cut without pressure. A mask that hummed with hidden emotion. He never shared these openly. He recorded everything, quietly, privately. Not to boast, but because he feared forgetting. Each discovery left him changed. He no longer meditated like the others. He didn't close his eyes to feel the Force. He opened them and stared into the storm. He felt more than ever before, but he also felt less human. There were nights when he didn't sleep, days when he forgot his own voice. The Force whispered always, sometimes in truth, sometimes in lies. He learned to tell the difference, but only just. He had friends once, a fellow master named Morav, who had studied galactic history with him, a healer named Tisani, who had helped him during his first experiments with life-preserving techniques. They stopped visiting, not because he changed, because he didn't hide it. Ajunta was becoming something else, and even those who cared for him couldn't follow. He wasn't angry, just alone. He returned to the High Council once more, not to beg, not to rebel, but to speak one last time. He stood beneath the great pillars of Coruscant, surrounded by stone and light. The 12 masters listened, and when he finished, they were silent. He had offered no threat, no demand. He had only shown them what he found. Proof that death could be slowed, that matter could be transformed, that the Force responded to will. He thought they would be amazed. They were afraid. Master Reln said it first. This knowledge is not of the Jedi. Master Vey added, it is not natural. And then came the sentence he could never forget. Ajunta Pall, you walk a path not of the light. If you continue, you will be cast out. He did not argue. He simply bowed and left, not with shame, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He had seen what the Jedi were, and what they refused to become. Ajunta Pall returned to Dromund Kaas one last time. No longer as a teacher, no longer as a Jedi, but as something else, a man the galaxy would soon remember and never truly understand. Dromund Kaas was quiet the night it happened. The storms had paused just for a moment, as if the sky itself needed to breathe. Lightning flickered far beyond the horizon, but its sound never reached the temple walls. Ajunta Pall walked alone through the ancient corridors, feeling the air shift with every step. Something waited for him. Not danger, not darkness, something older than both. He entered the deepest chamber, a place carved before the Republic, before the Jedi, before recorded history. The walls were marked with symbols even he could not read, but the Force recognized them. It moved through the room like a slow tide pulling at the edges of reality. Ajunta knelt. He wasn't praying. He had never prayed. He was listening. For months he had sensed it, a presence buried beneath the noise of the storms, beneath the weight of the planet, beneath his own thoughts. Whenever he reached for it, it slipped away like smoke. But tonight, it didn't run. It waited. He closed his eyes, and the whisper came. It wasn't a voice. Not at first. It was a breath in the deepest part of his mind, a faint pressure as if the Force itself was leaning closer. Then it grew clearer, sharper, a tone that vibrated through his chest and down into the stone beneath him. It spoke his name, Ajunta, not the way a Jedi spoke it with formality. This whisper carried recognition, as if it had known him before he existed, as if it had been waiting for him to return. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt tight and his hands trembled. The Force around him twisted, bending space like fingers pressing into fabric. He could feel the dark side now not as a threat, but as an invitation. Cold, patient, ancient. The whisper called again. You see what they do not. Ajunta felt his breath catch. He wanted to deny it, to resist, to cling to the remnants of the Jedi he had once been. But the whisper continued. You sought truth. They sought control. He saw memories pour across his vision, like ripples in water. The Council's silence, their fear, their refusal to question their own teachings. He felt years of curiosity crushed beneath tradition. Knowledge locked away, power rejected out of fear. Then another image formed. A chain. Each link glowing with the Force, coiling around him. Not hurting, binding. Break this, the whisper urged, and you will understand. Ajunta opened his eyes. The chamber had changed. Shadows clung to the walls, moving like living things. The air vibrated with energy he had only felt during his experiments, the raw, unfiltered current of the Force. Not light, not dark, both. His heartbeat slowed. Something inside him shifted. For years he had walked between the boundaries of Jedi doctrine and forbidden truth. Now the boundary dissolved. The Force surged through him, heavier and clearer than he had ever felt. Not peaceful, not chaotic, alive. And then, the whisper became a voice. A deep, resonant voice that felt like echoing tombs and ancient suns collapsing. There is more. Come and see. Ajunta rose slowly. He didn't question, didn't hesitate, because in that instant, he understood something fundamental, something the Jedi had always feared. Knowledge was not inherently light. Curiosity was not inherently dark. And the Force did not divide itself. People did. He felt the weight of centuries press into him, not as a burden, but as a calling. This was the moment the Jedi always warned about, the moment when a master strays too far, listens too deeply, reaches beyond the limits of their order. But Ajunta Pall did not feel like he was falling. He felt like he was finally waking up. The silence of the Jedi had been broken. And, in the quiet chamber beneath the storms of Dromund Kaas, the first Sith Lord took shape in the shadows, unseen, unnamed, but already inevitable. Ajunta Pall didn't set out to betray the Jedi. He believed in the code once. He followed its teachings, gave his life to the temple, and walked the path of knowledge. But the Force didn't speak to him the way it did to others. Not in flashes of insight or serene wisdom. It called to him through questions. And the deeper he listened, the darker the questions became. What is death? What lies beyond healing? Why must life end when the Force surrounds it? He wasn't the only Jedi to wonder, but he was the only one willing to act. The Council taught that death was natural, that healing had limits, that some things were not meant to be tampered with. But Ajunta saw no line between what was meant and what was feared. So he began where others refused to look, in the fractures of ancient Jedi archives. Forgotten scrolls, misclassified holocrons, medical texts older than the Order itself. In a hidden wing beneath the temple's lower chambers, he found records of a practice no longer taught. A branch of Force knowledge that manipulated cells, directly accelerating healing, delaying decay. It had no name in the current code, but he found one in the footnotes of an older scroll. Mechu Deru. The shaping of living and non-living matter through the Force. He began with simple organisms. Not living things, not at first. Just the cellular remains of extinct plant life. Roots found in the swamps of Haruan Kal. Fungal spores recovered from Sith tombs. He used the Force to regenerate them, rearranged their structure. He brought growth where there should have been rot. Then he went further. He began rebuilding broken devices using only the Force, not by lifting them, but by reassembling their internal structures down to the last filament of metal. He fused organic matter with synthetic cores, gave movement to lifeless forms. The Jedi called such practices unnatural, but to Ajunta they were more natural than silence. He recorded everything, not in official Jedi ledgers, but in private files sealed under voice print and Force signature. He didn't want fame, he wanted time. Time to understand what the Jedi refused to see. It was only after his early successes that he moved beyond matter, into the domain of essence, into life. The first time he tried to reach across the threshold of death, it was an accident. A small creature, a desert scavenger from Tatooine, died on his table mid-study. Its body collapsed, its breath ceased. But its presence in the Force lingered for just a moment longer. Ajunta acted. He focused, not with power, but with clarity. And in that moment, something passed between him and the dying spark. The creature moved, only for a breath. Its eyes fluttered, its limbs twitched, then it fell still again. But it had moved. He stared for hours, not in fear, in awe. He knew what he had done, what it meant. The Jedi would say it was heresy, that he had crossed a line not even the Sith dared to breach. But all he had done was listen. The Force had shown him that spark. He had only followed it. After that night, he changed. He no longer walked the temple halls during the day. He rarely spoke. When others asked what he was working on, he answered with silence, not out of secrecy, but out of mercy. They weren't ready to hear the truth. And perhaps neither was he. Because the closer he came to mastering death, the more he began to feel like a shadow of life himself. Some knowledge was never forbidden. It was simply forgotten. And those are the most dangerous truths of all. Deep beneath the Jedi archives, there were chambers even masters rarely visited. Vaults sealed with ancient codes, guarded not by lightsabers, but by silence. They held the orders past, not the victories, not the legends, but the fractures. The teachings erased to preserve unity. The voices buried to protect peace. Ajunta Pall went there often, not as a thief, not as a traitor, but as a seeker. He didn't break locks, he asked permission, and no one told him no, because the truth was simple. They trusted him. Even now, even with his strange experiments, his long absences, his growing obsession, he had earned their respect over years of service, and most believed his search for knowledge was still grounded in reason. But Ajunta no longer searched for reason. He searched for truth. He found his first holocron in the chamber of a forgotten Jedi chronicler named Telenor, a mystic who had died centuries earlier. Her records were fragmented, but in them, Ajunta found references to an ancient tradition, the way of the second sight. A path that taught how to see past the present moment, not through visions of the future, but through echoes of the Force embedded in objects, places, and even blood. It was primitive, incomplete, but it revealed something vital. The Jedi had not always feared the unseen. Once, long ago, they had embraced it. That realization haunted him. How much had been lost? How many holocrons had been quietly moved into the lowest shelves, marked as irrelevant, sealed behind layers of protocol? He began to catalog them, not in the official database, but in his mind. One by one. Some were harmless, theoretical ramblings of long-dead nights. But others were different. One holocron, its corners chipped and humming with static, contained the teachings of Sorza Sin, a Jedi exile whose name had been wiped from most records. Her words were bitter, her tone violent. But within the rage, Ajunta saw something more. She described rituals for reshaping life, a way to bind the Force into metal, the first whispers of Sith alchemy. He should have stopped, but he didn't. Another holocron spoke of an order of Jedi who once experimented with transferring consciousness across bodies. They had been condemned, their experiments destroyed, but traces remained encoded between lines of disassembled data. Ajunta spent weeks reconstructing them, not to use, but to understand. He couldn't stop thinking about it. What if the soul was just another frequency? What if death was simply the point where the signal collapsed? He kept these holocrons hidden, not out of fear but because they were incomplete, dangerous, fractured records of truths once explored and then buried. But even fragments had meaning. Ajunta began to dream differently, not dreams of stars or temples, but of voices, old voices, whispers that didn't belong to any one speaker. They came from the Force itself, echoing through the words recorded in every shard of data. He stopped hearing the teachings as separate philosophies. He began to feel them as one long, broken message scattered across time by those who had dared to know more. It wasn't darkness that called to him, it was memory. And that was far harder to ignore. He kept his discoveries to himself. When the other masters asked about his studies, he nodded politely, spoke in half-truths. They still saw him as a Jedi, a little unorthodox, perhaps, but loyal. Only a few noticed the difference. The way his eyes lingered too long on certain artifacts. The way he paused when they recited the code. The way he watched the stars at night, like he was waiting for something to return. They knew what he was doing. Long before exile, long before war, long before the galaxy called him a Sith, the Jedi Council knew who Ajunta Pall was becoming. And they chose to stay silent. They summoned him once not as a warning, but as a test. 12 masters seated in a circle of cold light. His footsteps echoed as he entered. He bowed. He waited. No one spoke for a long time. Then Master Tellus, the oldest among them, finally asked the question. Why do you pursue what the Order has forbidden? Ajunta didn't lie. He spoke plainly, calmly, without fear. I don't seek power. I seek understanding. Life, death, these are the deepest parts of the Force. If we do not explore them, we surrender them to darkness. A few masters shifted uncomfortably. One lowered his gaze. But no one challenged him. Not openly. Master Reln, known for his strict adherence to the code, spoke next. And if that understanding leads you to the same place it led the exiles before you. Ajunta looked up. Then it is the code that must be questioned, not the truth. That was the moment. They could have stopped him, not with force, not with punishment, but with honesty. They could have opened the archives, invited discussion, admitted that the Force was more than rules and mantras, that even Jedi were still learning. But they didn't. They dismissed him, quietly, without reprimand, without praise, not because they had decided he was right, but because they were afraid he might be. After that day, the silence grew louder. Masters who once spoke freely with him now looked away in the halls. Requests to access restricted texts were delayed, denied, quietly erased. The respect he had earned through decades of teaching was left to fade. He had not been exiled, but he had been abandoned. So he left Coruscant, not in shame, but in clarity. He returned to Dromund Kaas, where the storms still raged, where the wind still howled through empty corridors, where the Force felt raw and honest. And there, he was not alone. Others began to follow. Some were knights who had once studied under him. Others were masters who had begun to ask their own questions. They arrived one by one, quietly, without banners or names, not to start a rebellion. Not yet, but to listen. Together, they studied what the Council had buried. Together, they reached deeper into the Force than anyone had dared in centuries. Together, they began to dream of something more. Not a new war, a new understanding, but truth, when ignored, always sharpens into something else. The Council watched. They issued no public decree, but in private, they spoke of containment, of intervention, of purging corrupted knowledge before it spread. What had once been curiosity now felt like heresy. And in that silence, something changed. Ajunta Pall didn't turn to the dark side in a single moment. He wasn't tempted by power. He wasn't seduced by promises. He was abandoned, left to face the unknown alone. And in that isolation, he began to believe something the Jedi feared more than any weapon. That they were wrong. Not just in doctrine, not just in practice, but in the very way they understood the Force. He still believed in the light, but not in the way the Council defined it. Not as serenity, not as restraint, but as truth, even if that truth had to be carved from pain. It didn't happen all at once. There was no declaration, no trial, no confrontation before the Order. Just a slow, quiet fracture, one the Jedi chose not to see, and one Ajunta Pall no longer bothered to hide. By now, his following had grown. Dozens of Jedi, most of them young, all of them gifted, had gathered in the shadows between systems. They wore their robes, carried their sabers, spoke the code in public. But in private, they whispered other truths, other teachings, reassembled from broken records and rediscovered holocrons. Ajunta never called them students, never claimed to lead them. But they followed him all the same. They called themselves the Adepts of Essence. He didn't stop them. They met on Dantooine, on Arcania, in ruins buried beneath the ice on Renvar. And each meeting brought more. Not soldiers, not traitors, but thinkers, questioners. Those who had seen visions that didn't match the Council's script. They believed the Force was not divided. That light and dark were illusions created by fear. And they believed the Jedi had lost the will to understand. The Council remained silent, but not for long. A message came, not from the Grand Master, but from a senior archivist, cold, formal, without feeling. You are instructed to cease your unsanctioned gatherings and return to Coruscant immediately. Further deviation from the teachings of the Order may result in disciplinary action, including exile. Ajunta stared at the message for hours, not in anger, not in sorrow, just in finality. The council had made its choice. They would not listen, they would not question, they would not speak, only judge. He gathered his followers on Dromund Kaas, not to plan a war, to say goodbye. He told them what the council had decided. He made no promises, gave no orders. He simply said what he felt. That which is buried will always rise, and those who refuse to listen will always fear those who do. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to leave the Jedi quietly. Ajunta didn't stop them, but most chose to follow. Not out of anger, not for revenge, but because they believed that truth was worth exile. The council declared him fallen. An official statement was released. Master Ajunta Pall, once a scholar of the inner force, had violated the principles of the Jedi. He had led others into confusion and darkness. He had abandoned the light. He was no longer welcome in the temple or any world under Jedi protection. They did not call him Sith. Not yet, because they did not understand what he had become. Exile didn't wound him. It freed him. No more secrecy, no more restraint, no more pretending to follow a path that led in circles. Now he could search without shame, ask without fear, build without permission. And somewhere, in the deepest part of the Force, he knew something had awakened. Not within him, within the galaxy itself. He had disturbed a truth too old to bury again. One that would reshape the stars. One that the Jedi could no longer contain. His exile was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. Because now, Ajunta Pall no longer walked in the shadow of the Jedi. He walked beyond them. Into a place they feared to follow. Into knowledge they could never unlearn. Into the legend the galaxy would whisper for millennia, the scholar who defied death, the master who shattered the code, the exile who would become the first Dark Lord. He never asked them to follow. Ajunta Pall walked alone at first, exiled, disgraced, marked by the council as a warning to others. His name was no longer spoken in the temple. His words were erased from the archives. The official record said he had turned away from the light. But that was not the full truth. Because the Jedi Order was not as united as it seemed. There were others who had seen what Ajunta saw. They had watched the council grow cautious, conservative, less like seekers of truth, and more like guardians of control. They had questions the Order would not answer. And when Ajunta was cast out, those questions did not vanish, they multiplied. The first to arrive came quietly. A knight named Exozon, once a healer who had studied the echoes of pain through the Force. Then Karnas Muir, a war tactician obsessed with the bond between life and will. Then Sauzas Sin, a philosopher and alchemist who believed the Force was a tool, not a mystery. They did not follow out of loyalty. They followed because they believed the Jedi had become blind. Some still wore Jedi robes, others shed them. But they all stood around Ajunta Pall in the dark chambers of Dromund Kaas, and for the first time said aloud what had once only lived in silence. The Force is not the Jedi's to define. Ajunta didn't claim leadership, but they looked to him. He had walked the path first. He had reached further than anyone had dared. And though his eyes no longer held the calm light of the temple, they carried something else. Conviction. They began to call themselves the Fallen. Not in shame but in defiance. Because they had not fallen. They had been pushed. Together, they studied what had been denied. They shared forbidden holocrons, conducted experiments, reshaped matter, manipulated the essence of life, not recklessly but without apology. And what began as study soon became belief. They rewrote the code, not to destroy it, but to free it from the constraints of dogma. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. The first line came not from Ajunta, but from Saw's sin. It was born not of anger, but recognition, a truth that none of them could unsee. The Jedi preached serenity, but every one of them had been shaped by passion, fear, love, ambition, loss. Through passion, I gained strength. Each line came like a wound healing in reverse, a scar opened again to show the truth beneath. Through strength, I gained power, not as a tool for dominance, but as a means of becoming more. They were no longer Jedi, but they were not Sith, not yet. That word still lay in the future, buried in legend, waiting for blood. For now, they were outcasts, seekers, heretics in the eyes of the temple. But something larger had begun. Their numbers grew, not by recruitment but by resonance. Across the galaxy, whispers spread, of Jedi who vanished, of temples raided, of ancient tombs unearthed, of holocrons missing from sealed vaults. And at the center of every whisper was a single name: Ajunta Pall. He didn't seek war, he sought truth. But the Jedi had made one mistake that could never be undone. They believed silence would end the questions. Instead, it created an echo too loud to ignore. The Jedi had hoped it would end quietly. They believed the heretics would vanish, that exile would silence them, that, in time, the questions would fade. But questions do not die, not when they are rooted in truth. And when the Jedi finally looked outward, past their temples and codes, they saw a shadow spreading, slow, deliberate, and patient. It moved through forgotten ruins, through lost systems, through the hearts of Jedi who no longer believed. So they drew their sabers. They didn't call it a war, not at first. They called it containment. Ajunta Pall did not strike first, but he had known this day would come. From the moment the council turned their eyes away, he had felt it. The order could not allow challenge. And those who questioned its foundation would always be seen as a threat. The first skirmish happened on Ossus, a silent confrontation in a forgotten vault. Jedi Masters arrived to reclaim a set of relics stolen from the archives. They found Karnus Muir waiting. The fight was brief. Not because Muir was stronger, but because he was willing to kill. The Jedi were not. They returned, bloodied, broken. Word spread quickly. From that moment, the temple could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. It became a purge. Fallen Jedi were hunted. Temples were sealed. Records were locked. And across the stars, sabers ignited. The war had no name yet, no leaders, just fractures, worlds split between old loyalty and new vision. Knights who had once trained together now met as enemies in the field. Masters ordered to execute former students. Students who now walked with new eyes, fueled not by hate, but by belief. Ajunta Pall did not revel in it. But he didn't stop it either. Because every blade drawn against them proved what he had always known. The Jedi did not fear darkness. They feared change. They fought not to preserve balance, but to protect their power. The battles grew in scale. The Jedi launched offensives on systems known to harbor exiles: Dromund, Kaas, Malachor, Relg. The heretics resisted not through numbers, but through knowledge. They used the Force in ways the Jedi could not understand. Rituals that turned stone to ash. Weapons forged through alchemy, not science. But even in battle, the lines were blurred. Many of the fallen still fought with restraint. They spared when they could. They offered their enemies a choice. But the Jedi did not listen. Because once a Jedi falls, he is no longer a person. He is a wound to be closed, a disease to be cut out. Ajunta watched as the galaxy shifted around him. He hadn't asked for this. He had dreamed of a new understanding, not blood. But blood came anyway. And with each passing year, it changed him. His teachings grew sharper, his words more final. He no longer spoke of returning to the Order. He no longer reached out to those who questioned him. He let them come, or he let them fall. Because war doesn't just consume armies. It consumes ideas. The Jedi said he had betrayed them. But in his eyes, it was they who betrayed the Force. Because they had chosen silence. Over truth, fear, over growth. War had come, and the light had drawn its blade first. The galaxy burned slowly, not in a single flash of light, not in the roar of one great war, but in the slow decay of trust, loyalty, and order. What began as quiet rebellion turned into the 100-year darkness, a name the Jedi gave it long after the fires had cooled. But for those who lived through it, it was never just darkness. It was a war of belief. Ajunta Pall had not planned for a century of blood. But the moment the Jedi chose violence, they unlocked something they could never put back. Every battle pushed the exiles further from the Order, and every retreat drew them closer to each other. They adapted fast. New doctrines, new rituals, new weapons. Force alchemy gave them blades that could withstand a lightsaber's burn, armor laced with ancient sigils. Creatures warped by the Force into monstrosities of pain and obedience. Ajunta and his followers weren't just fighting the Jedi. They were becoming something else. Their techniques stopped resembling Jedi combat. Their language shifted. Their eyes hardened. Still, they remembered who they had been. But remembrance wasn't enough. The Jedi didn't just fight with sabers. They fought with propaganda. They declared the fallen to be corrupted, possessed, not merely exiles but abominations. And for every Jedi who died to an alchemical weapon, their fear grew. It was no longer about stopping heresy. It was about survival. Entire planets became battlegrounds. On Arcania, snowfields turned red as adepts of essence clashed with Jedi sentinels in silent duels that lasted hours. On Nothoyan, a Force storm torn open by Karness Muir swallowed an entire battalion. On Relg, ancient tombs opened not for the dead to rise, but for the living to bury themselves in power they didn't understand. Ajunta Pall watched it all, directed some, withheld from others. He no longer stood at the front. He had become something else. An idea, a symbol, a warning. Those who followed him no longer needed his voice. They knew what they were fighting for. Not conquest, belief. But belief hardened under fire, and as decades passed, mercy became rare. Forgiveness became weakness, and Ajunta, who had once hoped to bring light to what the Jedi had ignored, found himself surrounded by followers who now sought more than understanding. They wanted victory, and in that hunger, something cracked. Ajunta withdrew from the war fronts. He spent years in isolation, meditating, creating, forging relics that hummed with energy the Jedi feared to touch. He was still respected, still obeyed. But he no longer knew if he was leading an awakening or unleashing a disease. He had taught them to seek truth, but now they reached for domination. Still, the Jedi could not defeat them. For every system lost, another rose in quiet rebellion. For every fallen lord, two more took their place. The order that had exiled a scholar was now locked in war with a new kind of enemy, one they had helped create. And across 100 years, as the stars flickered above battle-scarred worlds, both sides forgot what had begun this war. The Jedi no longer fought for peace. The fallen no longer fought for knowledge, only survival. And as the war dragged on, Ajunta Pall saw the final truth more clearly than ever. The Jedi had sealed their fate when they refused to listen. And now, whatever peace they had once guarded was gone. It didn't end with victory. It ended with collapse. The Jedi won the war, but not the way they imagined. They stood on broken worlds, holding fractured sabers, burying friends they once called brothers. They called it peace, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like loss. Ajunta Pall had vanished by then, not in death, but in silence. He watched the war end from the shadows of Relg, surrounded by stone and echoes. His followers had scattered, some hunted, some in hiding, some already whispering of rebuilding. But Ajunta didn't speak. He couldn't, because he knew the truth. The Jedi hadn't defeated him. They had proven him right. They claimed to fight for balance, but in the end, they destroyed everything they couldn't control. They erased names, burned records, sealed temples. And when they wrote the history of the 100-year darkness, they wrote it without guilt. Ajunta became a monster in their story, the first to fall, the leader of the exiles, the architect of war. But the truth was more simple than that. He had asked a question, and no one had answered. The fall didn't begin with rebellion. It began with silence, and it ended with something far worse than death. Legacy. Because while the Jedi returned to their temples, the fallen did not die. They hid, and in the dark corners of the galaxy, a new voice began to rise. Not Ajunta's, not Karnas Muur's, but the voice of something born from fire, a belief sharpened by exile, defined by hatred, fueled by pain. A new order, one that would not apologize, one that would never again ask for permission to seek truth, one that would wear its darkness as a crown. Ajunta Pall never called himself a Dark Lord. That name came later, given by those who forgot the man and remembered only the myth. But in the shadows of his exile, the Sith were born, not as an empire, not yet, but as a wound carved by silence, by fear, by a refusal to listen. The Jedi rebuilt, but they never unlearned. They taught generations to fear the dark, but never explained what the dark truly was. They built stronger walls, but never questioned what they were trying to keep out. And somewhere, in a tomb untouched by light, Ajunta Pall left behind his sword, not as a symbol of victory, but as a warning. Its edge still hummed with alchemical power. Its weight still carried memory. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a question, and questions never stay buried. The 100-year darkness ended with the Jedi still standing, but the cost was not counted in battles won. It was counted in the future. They could no longer escape. Because Ajunta Pall did not fall alone, he fell with them. And through him, the Force revealed a truth too large to be silenced. That darkness is not born from hatred. It's born from rejection, from exile, from voices told to be quiet when they cry out to understand. And in that quiet, something ancient stirs, waiting, still. They were no longer Jedi, not in name, not in creed, not in the eyes of the galaxy. Ajunta Pall and his followers had left the known worlds behind, fled the Republic, escaped the war they had lost, and the truth they still carried. There were no more sanctuaries, no more archives, no more debate, only silence and stars. They traveled into the deep core first to Dromund Kaas, where storms remembered their names. Then further, past ancient star charts and half-finished Republic probes, deeper into space where even the Force felt unfamiliar. These were places the Jedi refused to map, not because they couldn't, but because they feared what they might find. The exiles didn't fear it. They were drawn to it. Each world they passed seemed to echo their exile. Worlds abandoned, scarred, broken, and yet full of power untamed and raw. They listened for voices in the Force, traces of ancient civilizations, whispers buried beneath stone and wind. And then they found it. Korriban, a world that didn't just exist, it remembered. Its surface was dry, carved by 1,000 years of wind and bones. Red sand stretched endlessly, covering forgotten cities and broken temples. Lightning crawled across the sky without sound. It felt like a graveyard, but one that still breathed. The Force was different here. Not chaotic, not dark, just ancient. It didn't call to them, it watched them. They landed near a valley carved into the planet's crust, a place where statues had collapsed into dust, but the faces carved into them still stared through time. Their ship cracked against the surface like an echo, and the red mist swallowed it whole. They stepped into history, and for the first time since leaving the Republic, they didn't feel lost. They felt expected. At first, they thought Korriban was abandoned, but it wasn't. In the hills beyond the valley, they saw movement. Eyes glowing faintly in the dark, red skin marked with symbols, spears carved from obsidian, warriors watching from the rocks. They didn't attack. They didn't run. They stood still, not in fear, but in recognition. They were the Sith. Not in name, not in philosophy, but in blood. A species older than the Republic, older than the Order. Born of Korriban, shaped by war and ritual. Their language burned like fire when spoken aloud. Their customs were carved into skin. Their culture bled into the very ground. Ajunta Pall saw them not as enemies. He saw them as mirrors. The Sith were not weak. They were not afraid of emotion, of conflict, of death. They lived by strength, by trial, by blood. Their leaders ruled by will. Their priests spoke to spirits in tombs. Their kings held power, not by inheritance, but by dominance. Ajunta did not strike them down. He spoke. He showed them what he could do. He moved stone with a gesture. He ignited fire without touch. He healed a wound with only his voice. The Sith fell silent. And then they knelt, not in worship, in understanding. He had not conquered them. He had spoken their language. The Jedi had cast him out. The Sith called him king. And in that moment, with red sand at his feet and power in his shadow, Ajunta Pall knew something the Jedi had refused to accept. The Force did not belong to the light. It belonged to those who had the strength to hear it. Korriban did not welcome strangers. It tested them. Every breath of its dry air felt like sandpaper. Every valley held echoes of ancient screams. The ground itself was a graveyard, layered with the bones of kings and slaves alike. Even the wind felt hostile, as if the planet itself judged the living. And yet, Ajunta Pall and his exiles walked its surface without fear. Because for the first time since their banishment, the force around them felt honest. The Sith species watched them from the cliffs. Their red skin glowed under the harsh sun, marked with warrior lines and ritual scars. Their eyes burned gold, reflecting fire rather than light. These were not the robed scholars of the Jedi. They were fighters, survivors, children of a world that forged strength as its only moral code. Their leaders came forward, first warriors, known as the Red Kings. Not kings in the Republic sense. There were no thrones, no senate, no laws. Rule was a mantle earned and defended with life. A Red King was a champion, chosen by combat and kept by fear. Their power was not symbolic. It was absolute. Ajunta Pall stood before them without a saber in hand. He didn't threaten them. He didn't bow. He simply existed in the Force, and that presence alone reshaped the moment. The Red Kings had never seen a being lift stone with nothing but thought. They had never seen wounds close beneath a glowing hand. They had never witnessed a stranger speak without sound and still be heard. Their language was harsh, shrill, guttural, and deep. The exiles struggled to understand, but Ajunta listened more with the Force than with his ears. He understood intention, long before he understood words. The first Red King to speak was Kaas, a giant of a man with skin like carved obsidian. He towered over Ajunta, carrying a blade longer than most men were tall. He spoke of lineage, of trials, of the spirits that lived within the tombs. Ajunta answered not with stories, but with truth. He explained who they were: exiles from a republic the Sith had never heard of, warriors from an order that rejected them, seekers of a deeper understanding of the Force, not conquerors, not refugees. Something in between. The Red Kings listened, not because they respected him, but because they sensed power in him. On Korriban, power mattered more than words, and Ajunta had more of it than anyone they had ever met. The second king, Adus Tar, challenged him. A test, not an attack. He raised his blade and aimed it at Ajunta's throat. A lesser man would have drawn his saber. Ajunta didn't. He lifted one hand, and the blade bent, metal warping under the pressure of the Force, curling away like a living thing trying to escape. The Red Kings recoiled, not in fear, in recognition. This was strength, unquestionable, undeniable, the kind that rewrote tradition. And so, after a long silence, Kaas, the eldest king, knelt. Not fully, just enough for the sand to shift beneath his weight. The other kings followed. It was not submission. It was acceptance. On Korriban, kneeling was not an act of worship. It was a statement. We will walk beside you, if you can carry the weight of our world. The exiles were given shelter, food, names in the old tongue. Ajunta was given something more. A title whispered in the ancient language of the Sith species, a name that carried no translation, only meaning. Leader, warrior, one chosen by the storm. Not yet Dark Lord, not yet Sith. Those titles would come later. For now, he was something simpler. A man the Red Kings acknowledged as worthy. And in Korriban's history, that meant more than any crown. Ajunta Pall did not conquer Korriban. He transformed it. The Sith people were not weak. They were not waiting to be ruled. They had lived for thousands of years without the Republic, without the Jedi, without the Force as the Order defined it. Their society was violent, yes, but not chaotic. It had structure, order, purpose. But what it lacked was vision. Ajunta gave them that. Not with sermons or commands, with presence. Where the Jedi had spoken of peace, Ajunta showed discipline through dominance. Where the Jedi had preached serenity, he revealed the power of emotion focused, harnessed, weaponized. He taught them not to abandon rage, but to understand it. He taught them that fear was not weakness unless it controlled them. And they listened, because for the Sith, belief was earned in blood. The exiles did not remain outsiders for long. They took Sith names, they learned the rituals. They drank from the wells of fire, walked barefoot through the burning sands, and stood before the tombs of ancestors without flinching. They honored Sith spirits not as gods, but as warriors who had not yet left the battlefield. In return, the Sith gave them something the Jedi never had: devotion. The Sith species did not resist the changes. They welcomed them, because they saw something in Ajunta Pall that reminded them of their oldest legends figures who had torn the world open with their hands, who had spoken with the dead and emerged alive. And Ajunta let the myth grow. He did not deny the stories, he let them evolve. He became the bridge between ancient ritual and Force-born power. He taught the priests how to use the Force as more than a chant. He trained warriors to feel the moment before a strike, to see their enemy's movement before it happened. He gave them a new word: Sith. Not just a species, a belief, a legacy forged in rebellion, exile, and strength. And in time, the Sith began to change. The old ways faded, not by decree but by replacement. New armor, new weapons, new doctrine. The tombs of the Red Kings were still honored, but their wisdom was now weighed against teachings from the fallen Jedi. Alchemy replaced bloodletting. Focus replaced frenzy. The Force was no longer something they feared or worshipped. It was something they bent. Ajunta Pall watched the transformation with a quiet mind. This was not the order he had dreamed of. It was not a return to balance, but it was honest. He saw what the Jedi had always feared: power and belief combined, not controlled by rules, not stifled by peace, but free and dangerous. Others among the exiles rose in status. Karnus Muir began breeding new life forms, twisted by the Force, loyal only to their creators. Sorza Sin led temple rituals that lasted days, during which warriors claimed new names through visions and scars. The lines between Jedi and Sith species blurred. Their children were hybrids, their culture reborn. No longer Jedi, no longer only Sith in blood, but Sith in identity. It was not a conquest. It was a seduction. And the galaxy didn't even know it had begun. Because, while the Republic believed the exiles were dead, Ajunta Pall had built something stronger than survival. He had built belief. And that kind of power doesn't need an army. It only needs time. They had no thrones, no coronation, no senate to proclaim their rise. And yet, the Jedi exiles became lords. Not in ceremony, but in spirit. Not through conquest, but through transformation. The Sith people had not been overthrown. They had been remade. Their ancient kings were now memories, their old customs echoes in the dust. What remained was something new. something the galaxy had never seen before. The fusion of Jedi power and Sith instinct. Ajunta Pall did not name himself ruler. He didn't need to. Every voice fell silent when he entered the temple halls. Every ritual paused at his presence. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if the planet itself listened when he spoke. He became more than a man. He became myth. And around him, the others followed. Kaas, whose beasts guarded the temples and whispered in their dreams. Sorza's Sin, who shaped the young with fire and shadow. Zoksan, who buried herself in ancient lore and emerged with eyes that no longer blinked. Each of them had once stood in the Jedi temple. Now, they ruled from stone pyramids carved with blood and prophecy. They wore armor laced with alchemy, cloaks that moved like smoke, eyes that saw the Force in ways the Jedi could not comprehend. They were not simply Force wielders. They were lords of the Sith, and their titles were not given. They were earned through pain, through trial, through power. Ajunta Pall looked across the Valley of the Dark Lords and saw tombs being built before their occupants had died. Monuments to strength, to will, to the idea that death would not erase them, that the very ground of Korriban would remember. This was not vanity. It was design. They were creating something eternal. And it was not just power that held it together. It was purpose. A shared truth that none of them had found in the Jedi. That the Force did not demand obedience. It demanded understanding. And those who had the strength to seek it without fear, without shame, would shape the galaxy. But even as they rose, something else began to grow. Whispers. From the stars. From distant systems. From captured scouts and dying messengers. The Jedi had discovered fragments of the truth. Signs of activity beyond the outer rim. Reports of Force users on unknown worlds. And more importantly, of a name. Sith. It was no longer a species. It was a threat. The Republic began preparing. Slowly, quietly. And Ajunta Pall knew what would come next. He had not left war behind. He had only delayed it. But this time, it would be different. He was not an exile anymore. He was not a rebel with a question. He was a lord with an empire. And when the Jedi came, as they always would not find scholars or fallen students. They would find warriors, temples fortified by the Force itself, armies bred in darkness, weapons bound to will. They would find the truth they had buried, risen from exile. Ajunta Pall walked the halls of his stronghold one final time that night. He touched the hilt of his sword, not to draw it, but to remember why it was forged. Not for power, not for revenge, but for truth. And truth, once found, cannot be silenced. The Jedi had cast him out. The Sith had called him worthy. Now, history would remember him as something else entirely. The first Dark Lord. It didn't begin with rage. It began with silence. In the stillness of Korriban's tombs, beneath layers of dust and time, Ajunta Pall sat with a fragment of stone clutched in his hand. It wasn't shaped, it wasn't refined, it wasn't even metal. But it remembered pain. It was taken from a ruined shrine near the Valley of Golg, where Sith priests once carved their enemies into the rock itself. Blood had seeped into it. Screams had soaked the stone. The Force lingered there, not as light or dark, but as memory. Ajunta didn't choose it because it was rare. He chose it because it hurt to hold. He spent weeks forging in silence, not with machines or fire, with will, with alchemy. He did not melt ore. He twisted essence. He carved patterns into the hilt that held no meaning, only intention. He bled into the handle, letting the blade remember his pain. He fused it with his own presence in the Force, not just to wield it, but to feed it. And when it was done, it wasn't beautiful. It was honest. The sword pulsed softly in the dark, not with heat, but with hunger. It had no name, because Ajunta Pall believed names came after purpose. He tested it not on metal, but on memory. He walked to the highest ridge overlooking the Valley of the Dark Lords and held the blade to the wind. The Force wrapped around it. The air seemed to still. The silence deepened, and he understood what he had created. This was not a weapon meant to kill. It was meant to prove something. That pain was power. That suffering was not weakness. That the Force did not flow cleanly. It flowed where it was pulled. He didn't carry it openly at first. Not in court, not in ritual. Only in solitude, on nights when the stars above Korriban looked too much like the ones above Coruscant. But the sword did not want solitude. It wanted to be used. The first time he drew it in battle, it was not against a Jedi. It was against one of his own. A rival Sith Lord, born of the warrior caste, who believed Ajunta was growing too revered, too central to their people. He challenged him not out of hate, but tradition. Ajunta accepted. No armor, no shield, no saber. Just the blade. It cut through his opponent's alchemized staff with a single strike. It didn't burn. It didn't spark. It unraveled. The Force screamed through the wound, not just severing flesh, but memory. The warrior fell to his knees, not dead, not broken, just undone. The crowd knelt, not because they feared him, because they had seen something they did not understand. A blade that did more than kill. It converted. Ajunta didn't smile. He didn't raise the sword high. He simply turned, walked back into the tombs, and placed the weapon on an altar carved with no symbols. The blade had proven itself. And from that moment on, he never went into battle without it, because he understood what the Jedi never would. That belief is not always won with words. Sometimes it's forged, and sometimes it bleeds. It was not a lightsaber. It didn't hum, it didn't glow. It didn't burn with plasma or emit a focused beam. It was silent, cold, and alive. Ajunta Pall's sword didn't need a power cell. It needed suffering. Forged through Sith alchemy, it was bound not just to him, but to pain itself. Each carving along its edge was shaped from symbols drawn in blood and ash, not language, but memory. Not design, but purpose. The blade did something the Jedi had never imagined. It fed. Not on flesh, but on the Force. Every time it touched a living being, whether in combat, ceremony, or ritual, it took something. A trace of life, a pulse of essence, a flicker of identity. It didn't just kill, it absorbed, and Ajunta felt it all. Each strike left behind more than a corpse. It left behind echoes. The first time, he noticed it was during a duel with a Sith initiate. Not an enemy, but a student seeking ascension. The blade passed through flesh like water, and for a moment, just a breath, Ajunta felt the initiate's fear. Not from memory, from within the blade itself. A whisper, a flash of pain, a name, then silence. He told no one, because deep down he understood. This weapon was no longer just a tool. It was a vessel, and it was growing heavier. He began to feel it between battles. When the sword rested in its sheath, it hummed faintly, not with sound, but with presence. It responded to emotion. It pulsed in his hand during moments of anger. It dulled when he hesitated. It became more than an extension of his will. It became his mirror. And the more it fed, the more Ajunta changed. He didn't feel it at first, only a quiet shift. His thoughts became sharper, his focus more intense. But so too did his anger, his need to be understood, his inability to let go. Some nights, when sleep refused him, he would place the blade across his knees and listen, and the blade would whisper back. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in memories not his own, faces he had never seen, names he had never spoken, pain he had never caused and yet carried with him. He began to wonder if the blade was a record of his life, or if it had a life of its own. The Sith around him saw only power. They revered the blade. Some tried to replicate it. Others begged to touch it. A few even challenged him, hoping that death by his sword would grant them transcendence. He warned them, but they didn't listen, because they didn't understand what the blade had become. It didn't care about loyalty. It didn't care about strength. It only cared about memory. And memory is never clean. Ajunta started using the sword less, not out of weakness, out of fear, not for his enemies, for himself, because each time he drew it, he felt less like a man who wielded a weapon, and more like a vessel the weapon chose to carry. The Jedi had warned of this. Not the blade, the temptation, the slow erosion of self through power that feels like purpose. But Ajunta had already passed that threshold, and the sword had already chosen its legacy, one that would last longer than empires, one that would whisper from its resting place for thousands of years, waiting, watching, drinking the Force. War did not end when the exiles reached Korriban. It only changed shape. The Republic believed the fallen Jedi were dead. The Order hoped their memory would fade. But the Force is not so easily silenced. And Ajunta Pall was no longer hiding. The first confrontation came on Bedtime, a world of crystal canyons and violet storms. Republic scouts landed there, searching for signs of Sith resurgence. What they found instead were warriors shaped by alchemy, trained in ancient rites, and armed with weapons the Jedi had never seen. At their head stood Ajunta Pall. He didn't ignite a lightsaber. He didn't shout commands. He simply walked forward with his sword at his side, quiet, patient, inevitable. The Jedi, who confronted him, expected rage. What they met instead was belief. The battle that followed wasn't grand or glorious. It was slow, heavy. Like the air itself resisted every strike. Ajunta moved through the field with the calm of a man who no longer feared death, because he carried something that made death feel small. His sword cut through crystal and armor alike. Wherever it struck, the Force dimmed, as if reality recoiled from the blade. Jedi Masters faltered not because they were weak, but because the weapon felt wrong. It felt alive. It felt aware. Their fear fed it. And Ajunta felt that too. Bedtime fell not through numbers, but through presence. The Republic fled, the Jedi retreated. And when the valley grew silent again, Ajunta stood alone, wind rustling his cloak, sword humming softly in his hand. It was the first of many battles. The spiral continued. On Korriban, he He led the Sith armies against invaders desperate to root out the threat before it grew. They failed. On Ziost, he broke a Republic blockade with a single ritual that turned night into a void of crimson lightning. On Tund, he stood beside his fellow lords as they reshaped the terrain itself into a fortress of jagged, impossible stone. Each victory deepened his legend, but it also deepened something else: his isolation. With every enemy he struck down, another whisper joined the blade. Every fear, every final thought, every cry pressed into the metal like scars, and Ajunta carried them all. The Sith saw his victories as proof of destiny. They believed he had been chosen by the Force to lead them. They called him the First Lord, the Unbroken Blade, the Shadow of the Tombs. And Ajunta let them believe, because belief kept order, and order kept the blade from consuming him entirely. But deep inside, he knew a truth the others refused to see. He was not winning. He was changing. Each battle pushed him further from the man who once sat in quiet meditation on Dromund Kaas. The scholar who had sought truth through questions was now drowned in answers he could never unhear. He no longer fought for knowledge. He fought to maintain the person he had once been. And every time he called on the blade, he felt that person slipping. There was one battle he never forgot. A siege on a remote moon near the Stygian caldera. A Jedi who had once studied beside him, Master Relm, confronted him. He didn't raise his saber. He didn't attack. He simply said Ajunta's name. And for a moment, the blade fell silent. Ajunta hesitated, but only for a moment. When the battle ended, Relm lay in the dust, his final breath absorbed into the sword, his memory trapped forever in the metal. Ajunta didn't celebrate. He didn't speak. He just turned away. Because he knew then what he had become. Not a savior, not a leader, not even a conqueror. A man whose victories bent the galaxy and broke himself. Ajunta Pall never called himself a tyrant, but the shadow he cast did. He had begun as a seeker of truth, a scholar, a man who dared to ask what the Jedi refused to answer. But years passed, wars followed, and the questions turned to weapons. Now, he sat alone in a chamber carved into the bones of Korriban, the sword resting beside him heavier than ever. Not in weight, in memory. It whispered constantly. Not in words, in echoes. The blade remembered every life it had taken, every fear, every betrayal, and through it, so did he. He no longer needed to close his eyes to see them. They came to him in dreams, in stillness, in silence. At first, he tried to resist. He meditated. He cleansed his mind. He reminded himself of why he had started down this path. But it wasn't enough. Because the galaxy no longer saw Ajunta Pall as a man. They saw a symbol. A dark figure cloaked in legend. A name that made Jedi speak in whispers. A force that reshaped entire systems with presence alone. And symbols cannot bleed. They cannot cry. They cannot regret. So, Ajunta stopped trying. He let the role consume him. He made the decisions no one else could. Executed rivals before their betrayal could take shape. Ordered the deaths of Jedi emissaries offering peace. Approved rituals that bent the Force in ways even he couldn't understand. It was no longer about belief. It was about control. The sword hung at his hip through it all. Not drawn, not used, but always present like a warning. A reminder that every choice carved another scar into his soul. The Sith followed him, obeyed him, feared him. And still, they asked for more. More knowledge, more power, more blood. He gave it to them, because he no longer knew how to stop. There was one Sith Lord, a younger warrior named Kelruth, who confronted him in private. She accused him of becoming the very thing he once swore to challenge. "You were a voice," she said. "Now you are an echo." He said nothing, because she wasn't wrong. But when she reached for her saber, he reached for the sword. The duel was short, and when it was done, the blade was heavier still. He didn't bury her. He couldn't. The sword wouldn't let her go. Ajunta returned to his chamber in silence. And for the first time in years, he wept. Not for her, for himself. Because somewhere beneath the power, beneath the ritual, beneath the legend, the man who once walked among the Jedi was still alive. Trapped, buried, forgotten. And he didn't know how to bring him back. Some say he began to withdraw after that he stopped appearing at council gatherings, that he refused new apprentices, that he wandered the tombs in silence, speaking only to ghosts. But the Sith didn't care. As long as the blade remained, they knew their lord still watched. Ajunta Pall had become more than a leader. He had become an idea, and ideas don't get to rest. He looked out across the sands of Korriban one final time, sword in hand, and saw nothing familiar. No stars he remembered, no voices he trusted, only silence. And somewhere in that silence, the tyrant waited not as a man, but as the reflection of everything he had become. He hadn't meant to fall, but the blade did not care, and neither did history. It wasn't called an empire at first, not officially, not by decree, but the shape was already forming. On Korriban, the tombs grew taller, the temples grew wider, the rituals longer. Each world the Sith touched became more than a battlefield, it became a monument. Not to conquest, but to permanence. Ajunta Pall never declared himself an emperor, but his people did. They spoke his name with reverence, not fear. Not because he was kind, but because he was constant. When the storms came, when the Jedi returned, when the blood was thick in the sand, Ajunta Pall did not fall. He endured. And in the Sith tradition, endurance was divinity. He wore no crown, but one formed around him anyway. In whispers, in silence, in the way even other lords lowered their voices when he entered the chamber. He had built something the Jedi could not destroy. A system, a belief, a future. The Sith Empire began as a network of loyalty not to law but to strength. Each Dark Lord ruled their own holdings, citadels carved into mountains, cities fed by blood rituals, fleets built by force-bound engineers. Trade flowed between them, carried by acolytes and mercenaries. Knowledge passed in fragments, guarded like treasure. And at the center of it all was him. Ajunta Pall did not dictate. He didn't need to. His voice was law, even when it wasn't spoken. They called him the living flame, the first lord, the one who endured, and he carried the weight of it all in silence. Because somewhere, deep beneath the armor, beneath the presence, beneath the godhood, he remembered. He remembered the council chambers on Coruscant. He remembered asking for truth. He remembered being told no. That memory didn't burn. It didn't haunt. It hollowed. The longer the Empire stood, the more distant he became. He stopped attending trials. He withdrew from the lesser wars. He spent his nights alone in his sanctum, sword at his side, listening to the hum of the Force as it moved through the bones of a civilization built on exile. And still, they worshipped him. The Sith people, once a warrior race, had transformed into something else entirely. Their children were raised on legends of the First Lord. Statues of Ajunta rose in the cities. Entire dialects of the Sith language were reconstructed around his teachings. His face was carved into the mountain above the valley of the Dark Lords, eyes blind, mouth closed, eternal. But he did not smile, because he knew what they were building. It was not an empire of truth. It was an empire of myth. And myths cannot question themselves. He felt the weight of every step he took, every word he spoke. Because they echoed, they reshaped people's lives, not in inspiration, in obedience. He had become what he had once fought against, not by choice, by gravity. Empires, he had learned, are not sustained by vision. They are fed by fire. And the flame he carried was consuming everything around him, including the man who first lit it. The cities rose slowly, not with joy, not with celebration, but with ritual. Stone by stone, Korriban changed. The planet was no longer just a grave world. It became a capital, a foundation, a shrine. Ajunta Pall did not design the cities himself, but they bore his influence. Everything the Sith built mirrored his silence, his precision, his power. Tall pyramids made from black stone, hallways wide enough for battalions, but lit by flame. Statues that wept dust. Doorways that only opened with the Force. They called the first city Garal, which in the ancient Sith tongue meant the place where hunger sleeps. It was not meant to be lived in. It was meant to be obeyed. And it was only the beginning. The Sith expanded across nearby systems. Relg, Ziost, Ashes Re. Each world became another piece of the design. Another city, carved from will and fear. They were not warm places. There were no gardens, no laughter, no childhood. Even joy was structured. The cities had curfews not by law, but by tradition. The Force was studied like a weapon. Civilians were raised knowing that survival was not a right. It was a test. Ajunta had not asked for this. But he had not stopped it either. He had built a machine, and now the machine was building itself. In Garal, there were no windows. Light came from above, filtered through red crystal. It burned softly against the walls, never enough to see clearly, always enough to cast shadows. Every street led toward the temple at the city's center, and every step echoed. No voice was louder than the Force. It was the heart of their civilization, and it felt like a tomb, because it had to. Ajunta believed in memory, in reverence, in never forgetting what had been lost. But the others, the younger Sith, the new lords, they believed in fear. They built fear into the stone, into the homes, into the breath of their people. There was one street Ajunta walked every day, high above the valley floor. From there, he could see everything, the towers, the statues, the temples carved from obsidian, and the silence. It was never broken. No music, no markets, no idle talk. Only chanting, only structure. The Sith believed this was strength. Ajunta wasn't sure anymore. Because strength, when it cannot be questioned, begins to rot. One night, he wandered beyond the edge of the city, into the sands, past the outer walls. No guards followed, no servants asked. Even now, no one dared. He stood alone beneath the stars. And for the first time in years, it was quiet. No humming force, no whispering blade, just wind. He thought about what he had built. A place that worshipped his silence. A people that feared his approval. A system where obedience replaced belief. He thought about the Jedi, about the council who once silenced him. And he realized something painful. He had created their reflection. A rigid, closed world, where no questions were safe, where doubt was treason. And the cities, beautiful in their power, flawless in their geometry, had become symbols of that failure. They did not breathe. They waited, like tombs. Because empires built from fire may rise in triumph, but they settle in ash. Ajunta Pall ruled from silence, but silence does not mean peace. While he sat in his sanctum, surrounded by stone and memory, the other Dark Lords watched. They didn't speak openly. They didn't challenge him. They whispered. In the beginning, they had followed him without question. He was the one who had defied the Jedi, the one who had survived exile, war, and rebirth. His power was myth, his name engraved into the bones of every new Sith ritual. But myths grow old, and empires grow hungry. The Lords had built strongholds across the stars, each one more brutal, more ornate, more demanding. They carved their own symbols into the Sith language. They renamed cities, rewrote history, created schools of power that twisted the Force into shapes even Ajunta had never imagined. They did not ask permission, because they no longer needed it. Ajunta still held the title of First, but in the shadows, they called him something else. Relic. They said he had grown too still, that his silence was not wisdom, but fear, that he no longer carried the flame, only guarded its ashes. And slowly, they stopped listening. Karnas Moor began training his own acolytes, warriors bonded to monsters, shaped by virus and will. They answered only to him. Sorza Sin created new rites, ones that rewrote the rules of pain and loyalty. She spoke often of the need for a stronger hand, a more permanent order. Others, younger and colder, began plotting without even the memory of respect. But none dared move. Not yet. Because they remembered the sword. It still hung at Ajunta's side. Untouched, but alive. It whispered through the Force like a storm waiting to return. And even the most ambitious lords feared its hunger. So they waited. And waiting, in the Sith tradition, is a kind of war. They tested his influence, ignored his summons, held rituals without his blessing, sent emissaries instead of attending in person. Ajunta saw it all. He said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know if he was still the one meant to stop them. He had built an empire on strength, but that strength had learned to speak with many voices, and those voices now echoed in places he could no longer reach. He began to sense it in the Force, a quiet unraveling, not a break, a shift. The Sith were no longer bound by vision. They were bound by ambition, and ambition does not share power. There were days he didn't leave his chamber, not out of fear, out of grief, because he had once believed this was the answer, that the Jedi's refusal to change could be corrected, that exile could become foundation. But what he saw now was not change. It was repetition, the same blindness, the same silence, only reversed and worse. Because where the Jedi had restrained, the Sith indulged. And in that indulgence, the fire that once freed them was now setting everything ablaze. He didn't stop them. He couldn't. Because to stop them, he would have to become them. And if he did that, then everything he had fought for would be lost anyway. So he waited too, in shadow, like the rest. The fall of an empire does not begin with fire. It begins with quiet, a shift in the air, a hesitation in a voice, a silence where there should have been certainty. Ajunta Pall felt it long before the others did. Not because he was wiser, but because he had stopped lying to himself. He walked the halls of the great temple, the one the Sith had built in his name, and sensed the hollowness inside its walls. The chants echoed too far. The footsteps sounded too sharp. Even the torches felt colder, as if the flames themselves were losing faith in the empire they lit. The people still bowed. The acolytes still whispered his titles. The lords still offered their empty respect. But something in their eyes had changed. They did not look at him the way they once did. Not with devotion, with calculation. Ajunta had built a world on strength. But now, strength was everywhere, and loyalty was nowhere. The lords met in private, far from the sanctum, far from the sword. They spoke softly at first, then boldly, then without restraint. They questioned his judgment, his silence, his restraint in battle, his refusal to escalate their rituals, their weapons, their reach. They questioned the First Lord, because they no longer feared him. Ajunta saw it all. He felt every crack running through the foundation of the empire he had shaped. He felt it in the Force like a wound reopening. But he didn't stop them, because he no longer knew if he had the right to. He remembered the war against the Jedi. He remembered the questions that began this path. And he remembered why the Jedi had feared him. It wasn't his power. It was his vision. But now, even that vision felt unclear, as if the Force itself had turned away. The collapse began the same way the Empire had begun. In silence. The first betrayal came from a lord he trusted, a warrior who had once fought beside him on Begaran. She sealed a temple without permission, declared her own doctrine, claimed her own following. Not rebellion, not yet. Just separation. Another lord seized a fortress on Zyast. Another took control of a fleet meant for the First Lord alone. Then another, and another. No battles, no blood. Just divisions. Quiet, methodical, like predators circling, waiting for the moment when the old leader finally shows he is too tired to bear his fangs. Ajunta noticed the acolytes turning away first. Not disrespectfully, but naturally, like a river changing course. They followed the younger lords now, the louder ones, the ones who promised power without burden, victory without sacrifice, strength without doubt. The empire had begun to rot, from the inside outward. Ajunta returned to his sanctum and placed his sword on the altar. For a long time he didn't touch it. He just stared at the blade, the weapon that had defined him, consumed him, betrayed him. He realized something simple, something devastating. He had built an empire to escape the Jedi, but he had recreated every mistake they ever made. He silenced dissent. He demanded obedience through example. He carried the weight alone. He let fear shape the future. He had become the center of a system that could not survive without him, and would not survive with him. The Sith Empire did not collapse in a single moment. There was no explosion, no assassination, no final, glorious battle. It simply shifted away from him. Power moved into other hands. His title became ceremonial. His voice became memory. His presence, once feared, became a relic. The collapse of the first Sith Empire began quietly, not with the fall of a throne, with the fall of a man. Ajunta Pall had risen in defiance, but he fell in silence. And in that silence, the future of the Sith prepared to devour the past. Ziost was not a world of fire like Korriban. It was cold, silent, honest. Its forests were black and twisted, its stone temples carved beneath layers of frost, its skies frozen in a permanent dusk. Even the wind carried a heaviness that felt older than memory. It was a world where the strong survived, the weak vanished, and the Force whispered like a dying breath. Ajunta Pall came here often, not to rule, to think, because Ziost did not lie. Its silence forced truth to surface. He walked the narrow paths carved through obsidian cliffs, his cloak brushing pale frost from jagged stone. The blade at his side remained sheathed, but its presence felt louder on Ziost, as if the cold awakened the memories trapped inside it. He was not alone, not anymore. A new generation of Sith trained here. Young, impatient, raised in an empire he never meant to build. They were stronger than their predecessors, shaped by rituals perfected over years of blood and alchemy. Their eyes burned brighter, their steps carried more confidence, their voices held pride, not fear. But what frightened Ajunta most wasn't their strength. It was their certainty. They spoke of the Force as if it were a weapon, not a truth. They spoke of conquest, not understanding. They spoke of destiny their own, without questioning where it led. These were not students. They were shadows of a shadow. He sensed their thoughts, even when they tried to hide them. Not because they were foolish, but because Ziost itself amplified every secret, every whisper. And what he heard felt colder than the air. They admired him, but they no longer followed him. They bowed out of ritual, not belief. He watched them from afar, performing trials in the snow-covered pits, dueling with blades soaked in alchemy, seeking visions in frozen caverns, chanting rites beneath statues of dead kings. They were powerful and hungry, and afraid of nothing, not even him. He stayed silent, listened, observed, and beneath every conversation, there was a pattern, a murmur, growing, spreading. He has grown weak. He hides behind the old ways. He fears what we will become. He no longer deserves the title. Not shouted, whispered, beneath breath, beneath ice. Ziost carried those whispers back to him. One night, he followed them, down into the deeper caverns where the walls glowed blue with trapped lightning and ancient Sith markings etched themselves deeper with time. He moved without making a sound, passing through shadows that bent around him like broken memories. He saw them gathered. 5 young Sith lords, a new council forming in the dark. They spoke his name like a challenge, not with hatred, with ambition. They said the Empire needed a leader who would act, not one who mourned the past. They said the First Lord had become cautious, predictable, soft. They said the Sith no longer rose because of him, but in spite of him. Ajunta didn't reveal himself. He simply listened. because he remembered another council on Coruscant, long before exile. Their silence, their judgment, their fear, and now the cycle had returned. Different faces, same truth. He had questioned the Jedi. They had turned against him. He had built the Sith. Now they turned as well. Not for justice, for power. He left the caverns quietly, the cold biting deeper into his robes, the blade at his side pulsing with memories he did not want to face. Ziost had revealed what Korriban had hidden. The empire he built would not be taken from him by war or fate. It would be taken by those he raised himself. And for the first time since leaving the Jedi Order, Ajunta Pall felt fear. Not of death, of repetition. Ajunta Pall once believed that teaching was the highest form of strength. That to pass on knowledge was to ensure survival. That by training others to walk the path he had carved, he could prevent them from falling the way he once did. But he had not taught them balance. He had taught them to defy, to question, to seek power in pain. And they had listened too well. Each apprentice he trained had once looked at him with awe. Now they looked at him with ambition. They no longer wanted to follow his path. They wanted to surpass it. One of them, Lord Nyris, had once studied force alchemy at his side. She had been cautious, careful. She asked more than she spoke. Ajunta had trusted her. But now she ruled over 3 worlds, kept a private fleet, and taught her own apprentices that Ajunta's restraint was a weakness, that the Sith needed strength without hesitation. That mercy was betrayal. Another, Vassa's Talek, had been one of his first, a blade master, a tactician. Ajunta had once called him brother, but Talek now trained assassins. Not warriors, not thinkers, killers. There were dozens more, each one shaped by Ajunta's teachings. Each one convinced they had surpassed the teacher. And in some ways, they had. They were more ruthless, more efficient, less burdened by memory. Ajunta had passed down knowledge like a gift. They had turned it into a weapon, and now they aimed it at him. He heard it in their councils, quiet words, carefully chosen. The old ways have no place in the new galaxy. He questions too much. He still dreams like a Jedi. They were not wrong. He still carried the ghost of the code in his mind. He still saw the future, not just as dominion, but as consequence. They did not. To them, the Force was not mystery. It was currency. To them, Ajunta was not a father. He was a door they needed to walk through and then close forever. And yet, they never said it aloud. Because they knew the sword still lived. And the blade remembered more than any of them wanted to face. So they bided their time. They sent messengers instead of coming in person. They rewrote rituals to exclude him. They built new codes, new symbols, new truths. Each apprentice who had once kneeled in reverence now ruled in isolation. And none of them looked back. Ajunta saw it happening. And for the first time, he understood what the Jedi Masters had felt the day they cast him out. That deep, slow dread, the sense that what you built no longer serves the truth, only itself. He had created thinkers. He had forged leaders. But he had not taught them to stop, because he had never learned to stop himself. Now they moved through the galaxy like fire, and the man who lit the first spark had forgotten where he placed the water. He walked through the halls of Ziost's great temple, alone, unnoticed. Sith warriors trained in the courtyard without looking at him. Priests recited texts that no longer bore his name. Even the statues no longer resembled him. They had begun to change his face. Not out of disrespect, out of erasure. Ajunta Pall did not rage. He did not strike back, because deep within him, the voice of the blade, once loud and sure, had grown quiet. And the students who once begged him to teach had now become the teachers of something darker. And they no longer remembered what he meant to protect. It didn't begin with a battle. There was no siege, no fleet, no declaration. It began with absence. One morning, Ajunta Pall rose from meditation and found the temple guards replaced. They wore the same armor, they stood in the same posture, but they didn't look at him when he passed. They didn't lower their heads. They didn't speak. He walked through the inner halls and sensed something missing. The weight of presence, the rhythm of footsteps, the force itself, thinner. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. He descended into the crypt below Zayast, where the oldest Sith texts were kept, guarded by those who still revered the First Lord's voice. The doors were sealed, not locked, erased. The markings on the walls were gone. The sigils of his lineage, replaced with newer glyphs, symbols of lords who once called him master. He turned without a word, because he knew what this was. Not rebellion, a coup, forged not in flame, but in years of preparation. One of the first to move was Lord Fastalek. His assassins struck silently, removing Ajunta's loyal attendants before sunrise. No blood, no screams, just silence where voices should have been. Another Lord Eris Kai claimed command over the temple's libraries, renaming them under her own lineage. She called it preservation, but it was erasure. And Lord Nyrus, once his most trusted, took the capital fleet without resistance. She said the First Lord had given his blessing. He hadn't spoken to her in months. Together, they reshaped the structure of power. Not through war, through confidence. They knew Ajunta would not resist. Not because he couldn't, because he wouldn't. They held a convocation on the highest terrace of Zayast, a summit of Sith lords, generals, priests. The sky above them swirled with shadow and storm. Ajunta was not invited, but he came. He stood on the edge of the circle, cloak heavy with frost, sword still at his side. And no one looked at him, because they had already decided. They declared a new council. 12 lords, equal voice. No First Lord, no throne. The age of Ajunta Pall was over. They said it was progress, a reformation, a liberation of the Sith from old chains. But beneath their words was fear. Fear of the man who had taught them too well. Fear of the blade they could not defeat. Fear of the silence that still commanded more than any speech. Ajunta didn't speak, not because he had no words, because they wouldn't matter. The decision had been made long ago, not in chambers, not in strategy. In their hearts, they had never wanted to follow. They had wanted to become. And now, they had. He turned from the summit, not in shame, in certainty, because coups are not born from betrayal. They are born from belief. Belief that the fire that once led you has burned too long, that it is time to light your own. And the one who lit it first must now be cast into the dark. He walked through Zayast city as if seeing it for the last time. The statues still stood, The symbols still bore his mark, but the people had already moved on, and so had the Force. The First Lord had not been defeated. He had been replaced by shadows of his own making, and the coup was complete. He didn't leave Ziost in anger. There was no rage, no vow of vengeance, no final display of power. Ajunta Pall walked away from the coup the same way he had walked away from the Jedi Temple so many years before. Silent, understanding, broken in a way no enemy could see. The Sith Lords thought they had defeated him, but the truth hurt far more than defeat. They had outgrown him. He returned to Korriban alone, stepping through the valley of the Dark Lords as if walking through memories instead of stone. The statues seemed taller now, their shadows longer. The tombs seemed to stare at him, not with reverence, but with judgment. He had built all of this, and now it no longer belonged to him. He climbed the ancient steps to the great tomb that had been carved for him long before he died. The walls inside were lined with murals of his victories, his teachings, his rise from exile to legend. Symbols of worship, symbols of fear. He touched the stone. It felt cold. He realized then what had been missing for years, what Ziost had revealed, what the coup had confirmed. He was alone. Not physically, spiritually. The Sith had followed him when he showed them strength. They abandoned him when he showed restraint. The Jedi had rejected him when he sought truth. The Sith rejected him when he found it. There was no place left for the man he once was, and no home for the man he had become. He descended into the deepest chamber of his unfinished tomb, a place meant only for him. Every step echoed through the hollow corridors. Dust stirred. The Force hummed like a fading heartbeat. He sat before the stone altar, where his sword rested. The blade he had forged through suffering. The blade that had consumed his victories. The blade that had devoured his identity. He lifted it, and for the first time, he didn't feel its hunger. He felt his own, a hunger for the life he had lost, for the purpose he had believed in, for the truth that had guided him before power had twisted everything around him. He closed his eyes and listened. Memories spilled through him not from the sword, but from himself. His first teachings on Dromund Kaas, the Council's silence, the moment he touched forbidden knowledge, the exile, the fall, the empire, the betrayal, the entire arc of his life replayed like a long, slow breath. And then the blade whispered, not with pain, with apology, because it had become what he needed and what he feared without ever choosing its path. Just like him, Ajunta placed the sword on the altar, not in anger, in surrender. He knew the truth now. The wound he carried was not betrayal. It was inevitability. The Jedi had feared what he knew. The Sith feared what he remembered. And both sides had shaped him into a weapon they could not control. He had never been free. Not as a scholar, not as an exile, not as a lord, and now, without power to cling to or followers to guide, he finally understood what freedom actually looked like. It looked like letting go. The tomb around him felt calm, warm, even. The Force moved gently, as if softening the moment. Ajunta Pall rested his hands on his knees. He exhaled once. Slowly. He was not dying. He was disappearing. The galaxy continued without him. The Sith Empire marched forward. The Jedi slept beneath their illusions. But the man who had once tried to unite knowledge and power had been reduced to silence. A silence that would echo for thousands of years. A silence that would become legend, because the wound that never healed became the myth that never died. He did not collapse in battle. There was no duel, no wound, no last defiant stand. Ajunta Pall simply began to fade. His power, once unquestioned, no longer commanded awe. The halls of his temple grew cold. The force around him felt thinner, not in the galaxy, but in himself. His connection remained, but something else had left him. Purpose. He had watched his empire grow from exile, rise from ash, and harden into a system of control. And he had lived long enough to see it turn against itself. The Sith Lords no longer called for his wisdom. They no longer feared the blade. They let him live because it was easier than killing a myth. He wandered through Korriban's canyons in silence. No guards followed. No students asked for guidance. The wind whispered against the stones, dragging sand across the ruins of what used to be sacred. He visited old places, places only he remembered. The site where he first met the Sith species. The ritual chamber where his sword was forged. The ridge where he declared the first temple open to all who could endure the trials. Each place felt smaller now, not because they had changed, because he had. His body, still strong, moved slowly, not with pain, with heaviness. The kind that lives not in the limbs, but in the soul. There was no one left to speak to. No one left who would understand. He tried to write, to preserve his thoughts, but the words failed him. What was there to say? He had not succeeded. He had not failed. He had simply lived long enough to become a shadow of himself. And in the Sith Empire, shadows are stepped on. The tomb was already being prepared. The architects hadn't asked. The priests hadn't prayed. It was a formality, a sign of respect for a relic too valuable to discard, but too inconvenient to remember. Ajunta didn't protest. He walked the unfinished halls himself, watched the workers as they carved his face into the stone, chiseled from memory and myth. It didn't look like him. Too stern, too proud. The real man had lines beneath his eyes, and regrets too deep to be carved in stone. He stood in the inner chamber where his body would be placed. The air was still, undisturbed, a hollow shell of legacy waiting to be filled. He felt the force wrap around him like a shroud, not violently, not cruelly, gently, as if the galaxy itself was ready to let him go. Ajunta Pall didn't speak. He simply placed his hand on the central altar, the one built to hold his sword, and closed his eyes. In that moment, he felt every life he had touched, every choice he had made, every name he had forgotten, and every question that had gone unanswered. He felt himself withdrawing from the galaxy, not in agony, but in release. He had not found balance. He had not found peace, but he had found the end. The Sith would forget him. The Jedi would curse him. And somewhere in the middle, the truth would fade like dust in the canyon winds. Ajunta Pall turned away from the altar one last time. And as he walked back through the silent halls of his own tomb, he realized something simple. He had been searching for freedom, but all he had found was rest. It wasn't meant to be beautiful. Ajunta Pall's tomb was carved in shadow deep within the Valley of the Dark Lords, where the sun never quite reached and the winds carried the voices of the forgotten. The Sith who built it did not ask him how it should be shaped. They did not ask if he wanted to be remembered. They had already decided what he was. A symbol, a beginning, a myth buried under stone. The entrance was wide and jagged, flanked by two statues that did not resemble him. They held swords, they wore crowns, their faces were blank, as if the truth had already been rewritten. Inside, the air was cold, still, heavy with the weight of things unspoken. Every step echoed down a corridor of silence, a tunnel where no light was invited. The walls bore carvings, not words, not stories, just fragments, symbols from his teachings, phrases from his earliest sermons, marks etched in languages no longer taught. The deeper one walked, the quieter the force became, until, at last, there was nothing but stone and breath. At the center of the tomb sat a slab of black crystal cut. With such precision, it looked like a wound held open by will alone. This was where Ajunta's body would rest, not embalmed, not preserved, just placed. As if even in death, he did not belong. His sword would rest at his side, not above him, not beneath. Equal, because the weapon and the man had become one long ago. The tomb was never consecrated. There were no rituals of peace, no blessings from the priests. The Sith believed peace was a lie, and even in death, their lords were to remain awake, alert, eternal. Ajunta had once walked these tombs when they belonged to others. He had placed the stones above fallen Sith. He had spoken the closing words. Now, no one spoke for him. The lords who had taken his place on the new council sent no delegation, no ceremony, no final message. They had buried him long before his body fell. To them, this tomb was a box to contain a past they no longer needed. But the Force disagreed. The moment Ajunta's body was sealed within, the air shifted. A low hum spread through the stone, so quiet it could barely be felt. But it was there, a pulse, a breath, a presence that refused to vanish. And in the silence of that crypt, something stirred. Not life, not power, memory. The tomb did not forget who he was, and neither did the Force. For centuries, no one entered. The Sith rose, the Sith fell. New empires formed, old ones crumbled. The names of the first lords faded from textbooks and temples. Ajunta Pall became a legend without context, a title without meaning. But in the tomb, nothing changed. Dust gathered, silence deepened, and still, the Force moved. Not loud, not violent, just enough to remind the galaxy that something had once happened here. Something that could not be undone. Ajunta Pall had once believed that history was written by the strong. That legacy came through victory. But his tomb proved something else. That even those cast aside leave shadows too large to bury. His silence had become his story. And his story was not finished. Long after his voice faded, the sword remained. Buried beside him, sealed in stone, still, but not dead. Ajunta Pall's blade had never been a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a vessel for pain, for memory, for legacy. Forged in blood and alchemy, it carried more than power. It carried pieces of him. Every echo, every scream, every breath, surrendered in battle. It remembered the rise of the Sith. It remembered the exile. It remembered what the galaxy chose to forget. And when Ajunta's body fell silent, the blade did not. It waited, not with hunger, with weight, the kind that settles over centuries, turning myth into warning. For generations, no one disturbed the tomb. not because they feared it, but because they didn't care. The First Lord had been forgotten, buried beneath newer names, louder voices, stronger empires. The Sith moved forward, the blade did not. It sat on the altar like a closed book, unread, untouched, but not unliving. Because the Force does not forget, and neither does a blade forged through suffering. Then, one day, the tomb opened. Not from within, from above. Centuries after Ajunta's death, during the Jedi Civil War, a figure walked into the darkness, calm, alone, without fear. His name was Revan. He had heard the stories, whispers from the past, rumors of a sword tied to a Sith too old to matter and too dangerous to dismiss. He didn't come for power. He came for truth. The crypt did not resist him. The blade did not attack. It waited. Revan stood before the altar, gazing down at the sword. It hadn't rusted. It hadn't cracked. It looked as it had when Ajunta last held it. Silent, complete, heavy with something deeper than the Force. And then it spoke. Not aloud. Through presence. Revan heard it as a thought, not his own. A voice tangled in regret, not demanding, not proud. Apologetic. It wasn't just the sword. It was Ajunta. His spirit lingered. Not as a ghost, but as a wound. He did not rise from the grave. He did not shout his name. He whispered. He spoke of the fall, of the exile, of the questions that began it all. He didn't ask Revan to take the blade. He asked Revan to understand it. Because the sword had become a curse, not of darkness, of memory. It had consumed every piece of Ajunta's life, and now, even in death, it held him there. In the tomb, in the stone, in the silence, he asked for one thing. Let it go. Revan listened. He could have taken the weapon, could have bent it to his will, could have claimed the power of the First Lord. But he saw the truth. It wasn't power anymore. It was grief. And some grief is not meant to be carried. Revan placed the sword back on the altar, gently, without judgment. Ajunta Pall's voice faded, not in pain, in peace. The tomb returned to silence, but the sword still sat there, not forgotten, not lost, just waiting for the next one who would try to understand what it truly meant to hold the weight of legacy. The Sith called it a relic, a tool, a symbol, but those who knew understood something deeper. It wasn't the blade that had outlived its master. It was the pain, and the galaxy would carry that pain until someone was brave enough to put it down. They never heard his last words. Not the Sith, not the Jedi, not even the Force, because Ajunta Pall did not speak them aloud. He carried them in silence, until silence became the only thing left. At the end, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't beg to be remembered. He simply looked back at the path he had walked, the temples raised in his name, the bodies buried in his shadow, the questions that had led him into exile, and knew what none of them could admit. He had been wrong. Not about the Force, not about the Jedi, not even about the Sith. He had been wrong about himself. He thought he could carry the truth without being consumed by it. That he could wield the dark without losing the light. That he could change the galaxy without becoming the very thing he had once feared. But no one escapes the gravity of their own myth. And Ajunta Pall had become gravity. He had become the foundation of everything the Sith would become, not because he intended it, but because no one else would dare go first. The Jedi feared him, the Sith worshipped him, and in both, his name became armor for their beliefs. Neither side saw the man, only the symbol. And in the end, the man who had wanted to free the Force from boundaries became the one who chained it again. That was the wound. Not exile, not betrayal, not death, but knowing that the galaxy would move forward on a lie, with his name carved into it. And so his final breath was not a curse. It was an apology. Soft, wordless, but real. To the Jedi who could not see past their fear. To the apprentices who had grown into monsters. To the Force itself. And most of all, to himself. Because he had started with a question, one so simple it could have changed everything. What if the Force is more than light and dark? But no one had answered. So he became the answer. And in doing so, he became the problem. That apology lived on, not in words, but in whispers. It echoed in the cracks of the tomb, in the stone walls that bore no inscription, in the way the Force dipped when his name was spoken. It lived in the hesitation of every Sith who doubted the path, in the quiet sorrow of every Jedi who looked inward and found silence. Ajunta Pall's story did not end in fire. It ended in memory. A warning carved in stillness. A question no longer spoken. A blade that no longer burned. He did not ascend. He did not vanish. He remained. A presence in the Force, too quiet to be noticed, but too deep to be ignored. Revan had felt it. Others would too, because some truths cannot be buried. They linger, they haunt, they wait. And in the Valley of the Dark Lords, surrounded by tombs filled with ambition and power, there is only one that does not shout its legend. It whispers. Ajunta Pall's tomb stands in silence, and those who listen closely will hear something the Sith no longer understand. A voice from the beginning, tired, hollow, human, whispering a single word. Sorry. Time does not move in the Valley of the Dark Lords. It settles. Korriban had changed, empires had risen and crumbled, temples buried and rebuilt, names lost and recovered, but the valley remained, carved in shadow, untouched by mercy or memory. The tomb of Ajunta Pall sat at its center, not tallest, not deepest, just still. Thousands of years had passed since the First Lord vanished into silence. His story had become myth, then legend, then rumor. Few believed he was real. Fewer remembered why he mattered. But the Force remembered. It moved differently near his tomb, heavy, thick, like the air before a storm. Jedi felt uneasy near it. Sith avoided it. Even grave robbers passed it by. Something about the stone, about the silence, whispered too clearly, "Leave this alone." And so it remained undisturbed, year after year, century after century, until the war returned. During the Jedi Civil War, Revan, once a Jedi, now a question wrapped in a mask, came to Korriban in search of answers, not just about the Sith, about himself. And the Force led him to the tomb. The stone door groaned open for the first time in millennia. Inside, there was no light, no movement, just air that had forgotten what it meant to breathe. The deeper Revan walked, the more the Force shifted. It wasn't dark. It wasn't light. It was remembering. The walls held no writing, The altar was bare, the sarcophagus untouched. It was as if Ajunta had never wanted to be found. And yet, he was still there. Not in body, in presence. Revan felt it first as a chill, then a voice, not external, internal, a whisper tangled in sorrow. A shadow stepped forward from the far end of the crypt. It did not hiss. It did not strike. It spoke his name. Not Revan. His true name. The one buried beneath the mask. And Revan understood then this was no Sith shade bound to anger or unfinished vengeance. This was Ajunta Pall, the First Lord. But he did not stand like a conqueror. He stood like a man who had waited too long for someone to ask him why. His form flickered in the torchlight, not armor, not flesh, just memory made visible. His voice was quiet, as if every word required strength he no longer had. He did not demand respect. He asked for clarity. Who had the Sith become? What had they done? Was the war still burning? Did the Jedi still fear? And most of all, was it worth it? Revan answered with silence. Because he didn't know. Not yet. Ajunta spoke again, not with pride, not with power, with confusion. He remembered exile. He remembered the blade. He remembered betrayal. But time had blurred the edges of his purpose. He no longer knew if he had fallen or simply been lost. His words weren't lessons. They were regrets. He had searched for understanding and found only worship. He had tried to forge a future and became its prison. And now, centuries later, he remained not as punishment, but because he could not leave behind a story with no ending. He asked Revan one question, a simple one. What do they say I was? Revan told him the truth. They called him the first Sith Lord, the father of the dark side, the exile who doomed the galaxy. Ajunta fell silent for a long time. Then he laughed, not cruelly, softly, like a man who finally understood just how far from the truth history had drifted. And Revan listened, because ghosts do not haunt places. They haunt ideas, and the ghost of Ajunta Pall was not vengeance. It was a memory waiting to be heard. Ajunta Pall had not become a Force ghost in the way the Jedi knew. He had not learned serenity. He had not found oneness with the Force. He had not ascended beyond fear, anger, or attachment. He had remained because he couldn't leave. His spirit lingered like a wound left untreated, not to frighten, not to guard, to ask a question no one had answered. Did I do the right thing? The Sith called him a legend, the first Dark Lord, the one who broke the chains of Jedi tyranny. They built academies in his name, buried blades in the blood-soaked dirt of Korriban, and called it tradition. They worshipped him. But Ajunta didn't recognize what he had become. He walked the edges of his tomb, unseen by time, drifting between the stone walls, reaching for memories that no longer held shape. There was no power left in him, no lightning, no fury, only sorrow. He had lived with conviction. He had died with doubt. And in the long centuries between, doubt became all that remained. There were others who entered the tomb before Revan. Archaeologists, treasure hunters, Sith hopefuls. Most didn't stay long. Some fled in fear, not of curses or shadows, but of something colder, regret. Because in Ajunta's presence, the Force shifted. It didn't scream. It didn't claw. It mourned. Those who entered expecting glory left feeling empty. And those who heard his voice didn't always understand what they were hearing. Ajunta didn't beg for release. He didn't threaten those who disturbed his rest. He asked them what they believed. He asked if they knew what the Sith had become, if they knew how far the galaxy had fallen, if they knew whether the darkness they wielded was a weapon or a prison. Some laughed at him. Some bowed before him. None stayed, because Ajunta didn't speak like a lord. He spoke like a man who had made a terrible mistake and then lived long enough to see others call it wisdom. He had believed knowledge could free the Force from dogma, but knowledge became hunger. Hunger became ambition, and ambition became the Sith. He had not intended to create a new empire. He had just wanted to ask questions. And now, those questions whispered through the Force like wind through broken stone. The Jedi never returned. To them, the tomb was poison, a shadow that didn't deserve light. They didn't care that Ajunta's final words were not of power, but of pain. They closed the book on him. And in doing so, they left him to become something else. Not a ghost, a memory, a myth, a question with no answer. The tomb did not resist time. It welcomed it. Dust layered itself like silence. Cracks grew where hands once carved honor. The symbols faded, the altar dimmed. But Ajunta remained not bound by anger, but by longing. To be seen, to be heard, to be understood. And when Revan entered, the Force stirred, not because of who he was, but because he had come without judgment. Ajunta had spoken to many, but Revan listened. And that changed everything. Because sometimes a spirit does not need to be defeated. It does not need to be cleansed. It needs to be acknowledged. Ajunta Pall was no longer a warrior. He was no longer a lord. He was no longer a Sith. He was a voice in the dark, asking again and again if there had been another path. And in Revan's silence, he found something he had never found in life: compassion. Revan did not come to Ajunta's tomb as a conqueror. He came as a seeker. By the time he entered the shadowed crypt beneath Korriban, he had already become a legend of his own Jedi Knight, war hero, fallen Sith, amnesiac, exile. Revan's name meant many things to many people. But here, in this tomb, none of that mattered. Because Ajunta Pall did not speak to titles. He spoke to the soul behind them. At first, Revan did not speak. He listened. The Force trembled slightly, not in fear, not in warning, in recognition. The shade of Ajunta Pall appeared slowly, not summoned, not provoked. He emerged like a forgotten memory finding shape. Cloaked in faded light, the details of his face half erased by time. He did not ask Revan who he was. He already knew. Not the name, not the face, the pain. He had felt it before, long ago. Ajunta greeted him not with anger, but with a question. "Do you know what they did with my name?" Revan said nothing, because how could he answer? The galaxy had made Ajunta a symbol of rebellion, of power, of darkness. But none of those things captured the man who now stood before him. A man unsure of who he had been, or what he had become. Ajunta's voice did not echo in the tomb. It whispered, almost ashamed of itself. He spoke of exile, of betrayal, of visions that once felt like clarity. He spoke of the moment he turned from the Jedi not out of hatred, but out of a desperate belief that there was more. That the Force was bigger than its rules. And when he found the darkness, it embraced him. Not with cruelty, with comfort, the kind of comfort that asks no questions, only obedience. By the time he realized what he had become, it was too late. The Sith had already shaped themselves around his example. They had taken his doubts and built dogma, taken his fears and turned them into weapons. He was no longer a thinker. He was a foundation. And Revan understood. Because he, too, had once thought he could wield the darkness without losing himself. That he could change the galaxy without becoming its prisoner. Revan told him that his sword still existed. That the Sith still invoked his legacy. That they twisted his name into a war cry they barely understood. Ajunta did not weep. He didn't even frown. He simply looked down at the floor of the tomb and asked the one question no Sith had dared ask him in thousands of years. Was I wrong? Revan gave no answer. Because Revan didn't know. But he offered something else. A choice. Revan had felt the tension in the Force around this tomb, a wound that had never healed. He could take the sword. He could claim Ajunta's strength. He could use it in the war that still burned across the stars. But he didn't. He left it. He told Ajunta that the Sith were not what they once were, that they had turned from seeking truth to seeking power, that in his tomb, maybe truth could still rest. And Ajunta, for the first time in centuries, smiled. It was a small smile, broken but real. He thanked Revan, not for agreeing, not for obeying, for understanding, because in that moment, he was no longer a ghost. He was just a man, finally heard. And as Revan turned to leave, Ajunta's voice faded into the stone, not as an echo, but as a memory, finally ready to sleep. Redemption doesn't always come with light. Sometimes it comes with quiet. Ajunta Pall did not rise in glory. He did not transform into a being of radiance. He did not speak final words that echoed beyond the tomb. His redemption was not an event. It was an acceptance. After Revan left, the tomb returned to stillness. The torches dimmed. The dust settled. The air grew heavy again. But something had changed. The Force no longer recoiled. It breathed. Ajunta's spirit hovered near the altar, where his sword rested. It no longer glowed with sorrow. It no longer trembled with confusion. It simply existed steady, calm. For the first time in thousands of years, he understood what had kept him bound. It wasn't anger. It wasn't power. It wasn't revenge. It was regret. Not for what he had done, but for what he hadn't. He had spent his life searching for truth and died before he could share it. He had wanted to free the Force, but instead he had built a cage others learned to worship. He had wanted to challenge the Jedi, but instead had taught generations to challenge themselves until nothing remained. He saw it now. His legacy had not been darkness. It had been misunderstanding. And in the moment Revan chose compassion over conquest, Ajunta saw something he had forgotten long ago. The Force forgives those who forgive themselves. He moved slowly, not across stone, but through memory. He revisited moments that once haunted him. His first steps into exile. His first victory on Korriban. His first betrayal. His first death. Each memory felt lighter now, like something finally allowed to fall from his hands. He looked upon the sword, the relic that held the weight of his life, and understood the truth. It had never wanted to consume him. It had wanted to reflect him. His pain, his fear, his questions. And now, even the blade was silent. It no longer murmured with trapped voices, no longer pulsed with hunger. It rested like a stone finally returned to the earth. Ajunta laid his hand upon it, not in possession, but in farewell. He whispered something then, a word the Force absorbed before it touched the air. Not sorry. He had said that already. This word meant something else. Release. His form grew faint, not dissolving into darkness, but into something softer, something peaceful. The edges of his spirit dimmed until only a faint outline remained. He could leave now. Not because his sins were forgiven, not because his legacy was repaired, but because he finally understood that redemption is not granted by others. It is chosen. The tomb did not shake. The valley did not roar. No light pierced the stone. Only silence changed. The kind of silence that feels warm instead of cold. The kind that accompanies acceptance instead of despair. The kind that lets a soul rest. Ajunta Pall faded completely, leaving no trace but memory, no echo but calm, no regret but wisdom that finally settled into the Force. The sword remained on the altar, untouched. A warning, a lesson, a story waiting for the one who could read it. And deep within the valley, the Force whispered the truth history had forgotten. Ajunta Pall had not died a monster. He had not died a god. He had not died a legend. He had died a man. And at last, he was free. Ajunta Pall was not the strongest Sith, not the cruelest, not the most remembered, but he was the first. Before holocrons, before temples, before the rule of two, before the name Sith struck fear into the stars, it was just a word whispered through cracked stone and bleeding sand. A word spoken by a man who no longer trusted the light. Ajunta had never intended to create a new order. He had meant only to escape the silence of the Jedi Council, escape the fear of forbidden truths, escape the chains that shaped the Force into something narrow and small. But escape is not peace. It is flight. And those who flee with fear in their hearts do not leave their darkness behind, they carry it with them. Korriban welcomed him. Its people bowed. The Force thickened around him, eager to be used. And so Ajunta did what so many do when offered worship. He believed it. In that moment, the whisper became something more. A doctrine, a path, a shadow with shape. The Sith did not rise because they hated the Jedi. They rose because they believed they had found the courage the Jedi lacked. Ajunta's teachings were not about hate, not then. They were about truth. Truth that the Force was not passive. Truth that fear could lead to clarity. Truth that suffering revealed power. But like all truths twisted by pride, they began to rot. His disciples took his words and sharpened them. They removed the questions and left only orders. The galaxy began to learn that the Sith were not just different. They were dangerous. But it was not Ajunta's power they feared. It was his voice. Because he had done what no Jedi had done before him. He had spoken the truth out loud and survived. And so others followed. Some out of hope, some out of hunger. And as the centuries passed, those whispers became thunder. Freedom Nad, Marka Ragnos, Naga Sado, Tulak Horde, each carved empires from the echoes of Ajunta's first break. But none of them truly understood what he had meant to do. They built legacies in his name, but none of them returned to his tomb. They feared it, not because it was cursed, but because it asked a question no Sith wanted to answer. What if he was wrong? For the Sith, that was the true heresy. So they left him buried. But echoes don't fade. They wait. Even after Darth Bane destroyed the Brotherhood of Darkness, even after the Rule of Two was born, even as the Sith became quieter, smaller, more secret, Ajunta's shadow stretched behind them. Because it had never been about armies. It had never been about titles. It had been about a single idea, that the Force could be shaped by will. It was a dangerous thought, not because it corrupted, but because it liberated. And when liberation comes without restraint, it devours the one who asked for it. Ajunta Pall did not teach the Sith how to win. He taught them how to justify losing everything. And they did. Their souls, their empires, the galaxy. But the echo remained. A quiet question in every apprentice's mind. A whisper in every master's lesson. Who was Ajunta Pall? A hero? A heretic? A mistake? Or the only one who ever saw clearly? The Sith never agreed. They never had to. Because his voice was still there. Not in words. In choices. In every secret passed down through darkness. In every betrayal written in blood. In every master who whispered to their student, there is another way. The Sith never stopped bleeding. Every new empire they built was born on the ruins of the last. Every master carved their name into the bones of their teacher. And through it all, the shadow of Ajunta Pall remained not above them, but beneath them. As a foundation, he had not asked for it. He had not wanted it. But it was his all the same. From the golden age of the Sith to the secret wars of Bane's Rule of Two, every act of ambition, every ritual of power, every betrayal whispered across the galaxy began with the same unspoken inheritance. Ajunta's defiance. It passed from spirit to student, not through faith, but through memory. A legacy not written in stone but in blood. It was Marka Ragnos who crowned himself Dark Lord, with Ajunta's example burning in his heart. Naga Sado, who turned that title into war. Exar Kun, who merged Jedi knowledge with Sith cruelty. All of them stared into the abyss. Ajunta first opened and called it strength. But they never questioned what lay at the bottom. Because to do so would mean turning back. And none of them could afford to look behind. Ajunta's legacy had become something worse than feared. It had become necessary. Without it, the Sith had no shape, no spine, no beginning. Even Darth Bane, the architect of the Rule of Two, studied the tombs of Korriban and Ziost, searching for the wisdom of those who came before. But it was Ajunta's image, blurred and half-forgotten, that still lingered in the shadows of every holocron. And Bane, like them all, mistook silence for strength. He saw Ajunta not as a man who fell, but as the first to rise. But rising is not the same as healing. As the Rule of Two twisted through centuries, the Sith became quieter, sharper, their hatred compressed, refined like a blade. And still, Ajunta's voice pulsed beneath it all. Not in words, but in intent. The same intent that led Darth Plagueis to seek immortality through midichlorians. The same hunger that drove Darth Sidious to cast down the Republic. The same cold certainty that allowed Darth Vader to break entire worlds for order. Ajunta had not taught them these things, but they had learned from his wound, his doubt, his regret, his belief that the Force could be mastered if only one was brave enough to try. And because no Sith could accept failure, they never accepted his regret. They only accepted his power. The darkness spread not just across stars, but across meaning. The Sith forgot they had ever been a people. Forgot Korriban was once a home. Forgot that the first Dark Lord never called himself Lord at all. They turned history into myth, myth into weapon, and weapon into truth. But myths leave holes, and in those holes, something terrible grows. Ajunta Pall became a symbol not of darkness, but of permission. Permission to betray. Permission to rule. Permission to remake the galaxy in one's own image. And yet, if they had listened, truly listened, they would have heard something different in his silence. Not permission. Warning. The Sith passed that silence down like scripture. Every apprentice, every whisper, every rise, and every fall. Because that is what his legacy had become. Not a lesson, but a pattern. Over and over again. A cycle of ambition without memory. Hatred without understanding. Victory without peace. All birthed from a single choice. To turn away from the Jedi and never look back. Empires rise from many things: armies, credits, ambition. But sometimes they rise from a name. Ajunta Pall. A name whispered in ancient chambers. A name carved into half-collapsed temples. A name carried through the Force like an echo that refuses to fade. He never knew how far it would travel. Long after his body turned to dust, his name shaped those who would change the galaxy forever. Not because they understood him, but because they didn't. Misunderstanding can be a powerful inheritance. It began with simple reverence. The Sith of the old empires honored him the way primitive tribes honor the first fire they ever lit. With awe, with fear, with a hunger to control what they barely comprehended. Marka Ragnos used Ajunta's legacy to unite houses that had been at war for centuries. Naga Sado used it to justify invasions across the stars. Ludo Kresh used it to resist, insisting Ajunta's path was built on caution, not conquest. All of them were wrong. All of them were right. Because Ajunta had never left a doctrine. He had left a void, and voids demand to be filled. As centuries passed, the Sith began rewriting their own history. Every lord needed a foundation, a myth to stand upon. They sharpened Ajunta's story into whatever shape suited their rule. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a conqueror. To many, a warning. But his name never disappeared. When the Great Hyperspace War erupted, it was shouted in battle as a symbol of destiny. When the golden age of the Sith collapsed, scholars whispered his legacy like a curse. When the Republic purged the Sith from existence, his name survived in secret vaults and forbidden scrolls. Even when Darth Bane rose from the ashes of the Brotherhood of Darkness, reshaping the Sith into a quiet, patient knife hidden in the galaxy's spine, he did so with the past etched into every step. He studied Ajunta, not for answers, for origins, because to break the Sith, Bane first needed to understand what had broken them. And that trail always led to the First Lord. Bane realized something no one else had dared consider. It wasn't Ajunta's power that mattered. It was his decision. The decision to walk away. The decision to question. The decision to see the Force as larger than the Jedi allowed. That choice, not the war, not the blade, not the Empire, shaped everything. The Rule of Two was born in that same spirit, a rebellion against the weakness of many. A return to the idea that the Force should not be diluted by institutions or councils. When Plagueis studied life and death, Ajunta's shadow lingered behind him. When Sidious reshaped the galaxy beneath a black cloak and a hooded glare, he believed he was fulfilling the destiny Ajunta had begun. When Vader fell and rose and fell again, the echo was still there. A name forgotten by the living, a truth remembered by the Force. Even the Eternal Empire, the ancient, long-lost dominion of Zakuul, carried hints of Ajunta's original defiance, that power is not granted but taken. That truth is not taught but found. Empires do not rise from strength alone. They rise from stories. And Ajunta Pall's story, fractured, misunderstood, half-lost, became the ground upon which every Sith empire built its throne. But here is the quiet tragedy. None of them ever understood the man. They carried his name through fire and blood, but never carried his sorrow. They wielded his example, but never learned his regret. They built empires from the shadow of a man who wished he had never cast one. History remembers victories. The Force remembers wounds, and Ajunta Pall was the first wound the galaxy ever chose to ignore. His fall was not the beginning of darkness. Darkness had always existed, but his fall was the moment the galaxy stopped pretending it didn't. The Jedi called it betrayal. The Sith called it liberation. Both were wrong. Ajunta Pall was not the father of evil. He was the first to bleed from a question no one else dared ask. What if the Force is not what we've been told? That question outlived him. It crawled through every century of war, through every empire that rose and fell, through every whisper of the rule of two, through every mask worn by Sith lords who believed they understood power. But the truth was quieter. His legacy was not power. It was doubt. And doubt is the most dangerous inheritance of all. Because doubt lingers. It lingers in Jedi who meditate on silence but feel something calling beyond it. It lingers in Sith who chase strength but never feel whole. It lingers in every apprentice who wonders if the code holds them back or keeps them safe. Ajunta never found the answer, but his wound became the map they all followed. When Revan questioned the council, the echo was Ajunta's. When Malak turned his back on mercy, the echo was Ajunta's. When Bane shattered the Brotherhood, the echo was Ajunta's. When Sidious rose in shadows, twisting destiny itself, the echo was Ajunta's. Even when Vader stood above the burning fields of the Jedi Temple, blade drawn, breath heavy, heart breaking, the wound was still there. The First Lord's question had survived longer than any empire ever built in his name. The question that broke him. The question that shaped them all. And still, no one answered it. Not the Jedi, who hid behind calm like a shield. Not the Sith, who cloaked their fear in ambition. Not the galaxy, which forgot the man and remembered only the myth. Ajunta Pall remained alone in the Force, not as a ghost, but as a lesson. A reminder that the greatest tragedies do not come from hate. They come from silence. The silence of a council too afraid to listen. The silence of students too hungry to hear. The silence of a man who carried knowledge he did not know how to share. His tomb became the symbol of that silence. A hollow chamber carved for a legend who wished he had been something smaller. Something simpler, a teacher, a scholar, a seeker of truth who had not become its prisoner. But fate had written him differently, and history followed its script. Yet, in the Force where memory cannot be erased, Ajunta's presence changed. What had once been sorrow became something lighter. Not joy, not peace, understanding. He saw that the galaxy did not fall because of him. It fell because his question revealed a truth it was never ready to face. The Force is vast, too vast for one order, too vast for one code, too vast for one man to hold without breaking. His legacy was not darkness, it was complexity, and the galaxy spent thousands of years trying to simplify a man who had lived in the gray. The Sith used his name to justify empire. The Jedi used it to justify fear. But neither ever understood his final message. The one etched between the cracks of his tomb. The one whispered in his fading breath. The one Revan felt in the quiet after their meeting. Power is not the enemy. Ignorance is. Ajunta Pall was the first to fall, so others could learn to stand. And still, the wound he left behind waits. Not to reopen, but to be healed.